All right. Just doing a sound check. I'm gonna play a video, and as the video play, we're gonna build from there. So we're gonna be continuing from what we spoke of yesterday. So just a quick summary, right? We have pointed out how what the Bible points out, right? Adam and Eve, them having multiple kids and stuff like that. And then we have pointed out that there was a flood that happens in the Bible. And then we talk about that there is going to be some descendants, Ham, Shem, and Japheth from Noah, that's going to make all descendants today. And we had went and pointed out how Adam and Eve makes sense to the fact of genetics, how there is a genetic Y DNA Adam and a genetic MT DNA Eve. And we know that that is a node that makes many clades, just like how Adam and Eve would be a father and mother that makes sons and daughters, which would be clades, and the nodes would be the parents. We also know that there's evidence of a massive extinction event, just like how it says in the Bible that a whole descendants of groups were wiped out even though the earth was filled. We know that that happened in real life, that the whole earth was filled with all types of different humans, and then after a catastrophic extinction event, they were wiped out. We also know that all humans today have a categorized name called modern humans. We know that that's also where we're going to get the divisions after the 800 lineages, where BT and CT split, where we go over the very important details on how BT and CT splits. And then those actually create the lineages of the AB YAP negative, DE YAP plus, and CF YAP negative lineages. We end up talking about how actually, if you wanted to link all humans, including ancient humans, archaic humans, and modern humans, you got to look for a atom that by the academic scale would scale millions of years old. We also talk about how the flood would have happened in between that transition. And there's a lot of evidence of that being at its final stage, especially when all the archehumans vanish after the events that they call the older and younger Dryas, right? Where there's a massive genetic bottleneck and a lot of things happen at that time. Now comes the important information of Babel. So we're going to now talk about Babel. Let me just send a message. As now, for me, it is nighttime. Kids are down. It should be all right today. All right. So now with that said, we're going to I'm going to play a video, and the reason why I'm going to play this video, because I think that he is obviously, he understands some things in the Bible, but out of many people who I've seen look at the book Trace, because one of the biggest things that many people want to find out is who is Ham, Shem, and Japheth, because the Bible expresses that to be real. So I just want to bring out an honest opinion of this, and we're going to build from there, from all the information that we're going to go over. So we're going to go and do that. All right, so let's turn on that screen share, as it is always a show and tell. So in the description will always be the methodology. If you have any questions, they will be shown here. And as I answer them, I will display them on the screen. And sometimes I'll leave stuff up there if I feel like they need a highlight. All right, so let's get to this review. And as this review go, I also break down certain highlights of it. Now, it's going to be a longer video today, but we're going to go over some sources that, if you want to put a time step or anything like that, it's going to get, I'm talking deep. We're going to get to some pinpoints, actual finds, actual ancient finds of all humans at a certain time frame. Remember, we're going through a certain time frame. So the time frame we're going to go through today is actually going to be in between the Neolithic transition to the Bronze Age transition. So that's going to be about, you say 10,000 BC to about 3,000 BC. But we are going to also show how that's converted, right? Here is a converter. I'm going to show you how a converter works, right? And I'll go over the process as we go over it. When I point out some of these finds, like let's say, for example, this one right here, let's say one that's 4,600 years ago, right? If we use that on a converter, we can actually find out how old that would actually be. Let's say 4,600 years ago. How old would that be on this converter? On the biblical date, it would actually be 2,700 BC. So for the input of that, it would actually be this. And the reason why we had spoke about before, how the carbon-14 works on a lot of these ancient finds. All these are going to be under 50,000. So the carbon-14 that's used for dating these is going to be understandable by these things. So we're going to first go over this review, and we're going to point out how the way we're doing it is actually an academic way, and why we can't use methods like what Nathan brought out because of how monophyletic families work, and that we have to look at ancient genetics in order to prove it. So first, we're going to look at this little review, as I thought this was very interesting.
Hello and welcome. I'm Peter, and thanks for
Okay, let me also mention this, that yes, this is a small channel, but one of the biggest things that I learned about channels is not about the size, it's about the quality of the information on how they go about some things. Now, he's a college student. This is great because most of the people that's going over this high information are usually in college, whether they graduated or not. We got geneticists who are working in genetics right now, like a couple different ones that I'm not gonna name right now, but they haven't finished their college, but they still go by the term geneticists, right? But they're still in college. So this is actually obviously important that you expanding on your knowledge and everything. So he's going to be taking a lot of things serious. Now he has some very serious videos. He does some very serious details on some very serious stuff that are actual genetic pieces of information. He also had conversations with atheists. Now, if you've seen his little debates or conversation on atheists, when the atheist has a conversation with him, he's highly respected. Like they're even this person right here, they even gave him a hand clap at the end and whatnot. He knows how to hold a conversation. He knows how to look into the deep information, and he goes very deep into his review on Trace. So it's worth going over on how he reviews it. So that's what we're gonna do today, is break it down. A couple highlights of it.
So who exactly is Dr.
When going over finding Ham, Shem, and Japheth, pretty much.
Chromosome lineages in all of these different regions around the world. So what exactly is Dr. Jensen's goal? I think Dr. Jensen's main objective with this book is to understand how humans diversified following the flood, using specifically the Y chromosome. And to do so, what he wants to do is look at the accumulation of mutations in the Y chromosome and the mutation rate, and basically try to extrapolate backwards to see if the last common ancestor of the Y chromosome lived around the time of Noah, whether or not we can trace the Y chromosomes of modern men back to three main groups, being Noah's sons, and other such things that would relate the genetics to a young Earth creationist framework of history. So what exactly is Dr. Jensen's argument? Dr. Jensen is basically trying to understand how exactly the history of the Y chromosome mutational load can fit within a young Earth creationist framework. And to do so, he basically requires a knowledge of how many mutations there are on the male Y chromosome, and then also how many mutations occur in a generation. That is, how many mutations on the Y chromosome does a son get from his father. One of the problems which Dr. Jensen faces is that the Y chromosome mutation rate, as typically understood by scientists, leads to a much, much longer history of man, surpassing 6,000 years even. And thus, Dr. Jensen needs to use a different mutation rate. And in his book, he makes the case that we should use a faster mutation rate based on some of the studies which he cites. And I'm not going to go into that because that's pretty technical, and I'm not sure that I could really give you the best opinion on whether or not that is a correct mutational rate to use. However, I want you to note that there is some disagreement on whether that is an appropriate mutational rate to use or not. Another assumption which Dr. Jensen needs for his conclusion to be correct is that the mutation rate is the same as the substitution rate. What does that mean? Well, the mutation rate is the number of mutations.
Now, I'm going to skip a little ahead because he just goes over some fundamental things, such as like the ages and things like that.
Is attempting to trace humanity's Y chromosome all the way back to Noah. You would think that he would want to look at the Y chromosome of ancient individuals.
Okay, so here's the part I want to show you. This is actually key because I was pointing this out on Jensen's work for a while, that he's been asking people to turn in their DNA tests, their modern DNA tests, because a lot of the studies that he's using is modern. And that's what starts to change things around when you use ancient genetics. I'm gonna let it play.
First of all is his exclusion of ancient DNA. Now, given that Dr. Jensen is attempting to trace humanity's Y chromosome all the way back to Noah, you would think that he would want to look at the Y chromosome of ancient individuals who lived closer in time to Noah than we do. But that's not what he does. Instead, he looks at the Y chromosome of modern people and uses that to attempt to reconstruct history. And this, to me, is one of the biggest flaws in his work, this complete kind of overlooking of ancient DNA. And he has a reason why he attempts to do that, but I think his reasoning there is somewhat problematic. So here's the problem. Dr. Jensen has found that he can fit the Y chromosome diversity of modern humans into this about 4,000 year time span from Noah to the present, using a couple assumptions which may or may not be faulty. But to do so, he has to exclude these other ancient people groups, such as Neanderthals, such as Denisovans, such as Homo heidelbergensis, all of whom we have DNA for. And because of that, I think this analysis is flawed. Why? Well, if he were to include those ancient genomes, what we would find is that the root of the family tree lies much further back. Dr. Jensen places the root of the human family tree as the common ancestor of Homo sapiens, the modern species alive today. But there were many other species of humans in the past, such as Neanderthals, such as Denisovans, which may or may not be their own separate species, but you get the point. There are these other people whose DNA we have that Dr. Jensen can't include in his model because it breaks the model and causes it to use more than 4,000 years of time. And I'm by no means the first to point this out. Many people, including Dr. Robert Carter, another young Earth creationist geneticist, has also pointed this out in his review of Traced. And I think he had something really interesting to say. Listen to this. Traced includes no significant discussion of the burgeoning new field of ancient DNA studies. There is a trend among many creationists to discount ancient DNA. Many claim the data are riddled with errors and therefore cannot be trusted. And then skipping down a little bit. Also, given a 3 billion letter genome, and given the fact that only relatively few nucleotides are phylogenetically informative, the usefulness of ancient DNA is a matter of statistics. One can infer which branch an individual belongs to, even with highly fragmentary DNA. Creationists who reject all ancient DNA studies are missing a wealth of information that tells us about population growth and movement in the darkest periods of human history. This is the true Rosetta Stone. And I 100% agree with this is the true Rosetta Stone. And I 100% agree with Dr. Carter on this. The ancient DNA.
Now, I'm going to stop it right there. If you want to see me do a whole review on it, I'll do a whole review on it. But look at the last part of this. It says, is a DNA or ancient DNA accurate, right? Is a DNA or ancient DNA accurate? Yes. This is from a creationist who's saying this. And I did a review. Let me just point this out real fast before we start digging, because we're going to start diving in, and I got some stuff that we're going to start diving in. So I just want to take that quick little bit there to point some stuff out. But let me point this out, this video that I did with Robert and Jensen. The reason why, because I want people to see side by side how their ideas was totally contrary. That we had one geneticist who was a creationist and another geneticist who was a creationist, and they did not agree. And that means that Trace is not a complete. It doesn't even convince creationist geneticists. That means it's something up with Trace. But here's that video right here. Can a geneticist tell you who are ancient Israelites? And that's important because the way that trace is made, it completely ignores multiple fundamental things of genetics, such as monophylactic families, which is how a family actually is united. It ignores ancient genetics, and it ignores the fact of, you know, just how the Yap plus works, how the Yap plus lineages work. So we have to basically, if anyone believes in the trace concept, throw that concept away, because one, the monophylactic families are just completely just garbage, and it is not defendable. It's just not defendable. He tries to claim who is Mizraim with the 25th dynasty of Egypt. And if you know about Egypt, by the 25th dynasty, you're going to have a sporadical of different groups there. You can't find out the origins of Mizraim by its 25th dynasty. You got to look for like its origins and stuff like that, right? So that's just a big major part of that. So let's take a little big dive in. Now we're going to dive into the sources. I know that's what everyone wants to get into. That's what we want to talk about, is the real sources and the reality of the secrets of the origin of our world. So as always, this is going to bring truth to our reality. So what this note is going to be called, I'll put this in the description. It's just before Abraham was. So all this is going to be from things from, like I said, 10,000 until 3,000. So we're going to have this, and we're going to go all the way to 3,000. I'm gonna put that at the bottom here, where we're gonna stop at. We'll stop at about, we'll say 4,000, 3,000. Where we'll stop. All right. So we'll put that there because we're gonna hit that nail on the head. So first, let's point out some things. So we're gonna first point out this. Let's first point out the legend. The legend is this that we have to remember. It all began with Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve had 3 sons. First, he had Cain, and he had a whole large family, and they expanded on. And their family apparently was killing people, because they end up witnessing that they were killing someone, that one of them had killed someone. So Cain killed someone else killed someone, and who knows how many else was killing someone. And we also know Abel was killed. And Seth, what would be the line where we would get Noah? So Seth will be the line where we would get Noah. Noah would have 3 sons. So we're going to note his 3 sons. So when the flood comes, all the lines here are wiped out. So that's going to be an extinction that's going to happen, a massive extinction. A whole group was wiped out. But what happens after the flood? What happens after the flood? So this is where we got to kind of understand what happens right after the flood, directly right after the flood. Now, let me ask you a question. Did Noah speak before the flood? Yes. So what does that mean? That means Noah, before the flood, would have a language. Now, remember how we was pointing out by the academic time frame, we would have had a catastrophic bottleneck and a flood that happens around the Neolithic. So we're going to have to take a look at some of the events that happened at the pre-Neolithic to the Neolithic time frame. And that's what we're going to look at today real fast. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into the roots of language. So early, we already talked about the extinction of like the Paleolithic people, like the ancient humans, like the Arctic humans and stuff like that. But apparently they had languages, but all of them was pre-languages, like pre-Semitic, pre-Indo-European, pre-languages, and they all apparently had an interesting root. Now, I'm just going to read an interesting highlight from here. So this is just talking about some interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Ties of words that they found to be tied to even early groups like early Natufian, like the word, a Semitic word like abin, right? That's used for stone, right? Abin or abun is a word that's a Semitic word used for stone, ibn, right? Ibn is still used as in a Hebrew word for stone. So they seen that it had some ties long time ago, and they seen that stones were used for building houses only as of the pretty much a certain time frame, the Kabarin, which would be a very early one, and that would be considered right before the flood, and also the early Natufian, right, which we have to point out as well. So these will be sons of Seth to Noah, right before the complete wiping out and everything. So that would be pre-languages. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out, because let me just point out something here, so that is kind of understood. So it says the first stone building were circular, right? They dominated agriculture throughout the Natufian and the PPNA period. So it just lets you know that when those buildings were there, they was there for a while. They were structured there to around 10,500 BP, right? So it was talk about how it had all those buildings and constructions there. And then what happened? The Younger Dryas happened, and then the culture started to change when we started to get a couple of different things that's going to happen. We're going to point that out. One of the first things that we notice is that there's evidence of almost like a united language. And we're going to go into the detail of a united language. Now, why do we have to point out around the time of 1500 and 1200 that there was a united language? Because remember, Noah spoke, right? Noah actually spoke. God spoke to Noah, and they had an early language. This will be before Babel. So they would have a language before Babel, right? So let's get into a little bit of that. So this is just a little introduction, a little highlight of it. It talks about apparently this language that ties other languages together. We're talking like Afro-Asiatic, Dravidian, Euro-Asiatic, Asiatic, which is pretty much the links of Indo-European. So it's saying that that was an early language. And how do we know? How do we know that that's true instead of like taking a secondary source? Let's look at some primary sources and some information that goes into the depth of this. I'm going to open up a source here, and it says this about this early language. We can just call it, they call it Nostertatic. If I said that weird, Nostertatic, something like that. Pretty much, it's like you can say that it would be the pre-language of Noah. That's the best way to think about it. It's the language that Noah would have had, because this is what people don't think about when they think about trying to find Babel. From Noah, from the flood to Babel, they had the same language. Think about that. From Noah to Babel, they would have the same language. And all of a sudden, after they all get situated, right, a little bit after the flood and everything, remember, Babel doesn't happen exactly after the flood, but it happens a little after it. So that's going to be something to note. But first, they're settling around in different areas. They're going to be settling around. But so that ancient language, it says, seemed to have existed in the pre-Neolithic. So remember how he's talked about that? Neolithic and the pre-Neolithic. In the pre-Neolithic, 15,000 to 12,000 BC, somewhere in Southwest Asia. That is to say, in the Near East, right? So, in the east of Mesopotamia, in the basically Fertile Crescent, right? And you know what the Fertile Crescent is, right? The Fertile Crescent is going to be right there in Mesopotamia. Let me just put that right here for the visual, right? So it's letting us know that early language was right in the place where it should be, right where we actually would start to get the movements of the biblical narrative. So it's letting you know that language is somewhere over there, just south of the Caucasus Mountain. So just south of the Caucasus Mountain. Let's go a little more into it. But first, let me show you what they're talking about here, right? This is just an interesting little summary that I thought was interesting. Was there an ancient super language they called this ancient language, which would be that language before Babel, right? Remember, it's going to be right before Babel, because a lot of people, when you're looking for the language when the whole earth was one language, you got to remember that all of them, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, was with Noah, right? They all would have the same language, right? So they're going to have a very similar connection and everything. And that's what that was talking about. I was talking about, indeed, when they talk about, they find out there's evidence that language would tie a lot of these languages together. Because remember, we talked about that 10,000, because remember, we're going to go 10,000 to 3,000 BC. We're going to see what's going to happen there. So it's going to lead us to Babel. So we're going to be leading us to Babel. So that's going to be very important. So first is going to be the pre-Babel events. So we're going to note that everyone had a similar language that tied many languages together. So we're going to look at that and look at how these languages are actually tied together. So it just goes on into a little bit of it that we just read a little bit about it. Let's go into some more primary sources of these things, right? So always remember these years are exaggerated, but here, let's get into some primary sources. Evidence for proposed superfamilies, right? Such as pretty much those ones we've seen, right? The languages of the New World, that one we was just pointing out, how you say that, no, Startic, something like that. And Eurasic, you can see right here, link the major language families in Eurasia. So you see what's going on there. It's talk about super families linking all these languages together and everything. And they know because they find basically common ancestral words in them, right? That's what they find. They find common ancestral words that tie these languages together. And this is ancient, right? So we're going to get obviously some very deep origins of the original ancient languages. So words point to a deep language ancestry across Eurasia. So apparently there was an interesting early tie of languages and everything. So as we know, by the time of 4000, that's when they're going to get like the same, like written about 4000 BC, a lot of written records are going to be recorded. But before that, there's apparently evidence that long time ago, even what looks like pre-flood, they had a similar language combination at a point of time. So just to kind of get into it a little bit, so they go over it, that it was during the last ice age and everything, right? It say they go to that time frame they was talking about right before the flood event that we was talking about before. Just going to scroll down here. So they just go on and talk about that it had to happen, right? Implying that some frequently used words have been retained in related forms since the end of the last ice age. So that's very interesting to know that after the events that we talk about ice age, when the flood happened, it melted all that ice and caused that water to increase. That's what we was talking about before with that fluctuation of that high temperature and everything. Because we're going to look at these time frames. These time frames are going to be very important for the spread of language and culture. So we're going to be looking at language and culture. But they do talk about how there's evidence for those things, for all those things to be linked together, right? So this was something that they did find out very important and everything. And that's why we also have basically a lot of evidence that the biblical narrative is talking about something very, very serious, very, very serious. So all this is starting to happen about the time that we're talking about, that 10,000 time frame. So this time frame right here, we're getting the moments right before the earliest events. So we're getting evidence of languages in their ties. I'm also going to show you some other people that talk about it as well. So look at how these languages, remember we talked about Dravidian, right? Already the Asiatic languages, Afro-Asiatic will be down here. More of the languages over here will point that out too. But these are more of your Indo-European connections and Indian connections, as you see right here. But they found out they have a close connection very early on, right? Dravidian, all types of different languages that will be tied together, right? They call it a fossil language, or sometimes it's a fossil language, right? Very ancient language that brings a lot of these languages together. We're not just doing a quick scan through here because we're going to get a nice little highlight of these things. So you can see how it would connect them to PIE. So what is PIE? Just to get an interesting scan of this. Let's take a look at it. You can see right here, it'll let you know that there's a root. So just like in genetics, you have a node, you have a root node. So you can see right there, a root node right there. So that's great to see. Just going to zoom in. So a root. And then right there, it shows you that the languages would have rooted. And then you can see right there, 15,000 years ago. So they would have rooted about 12,000 years ago. And that would be the event of the flood that we was talking about. So the flood happened, and early on, they still would have had an early language. Now, this is what you got to understand. We're going to point out something that happens at the time of Babel, right? When it says the earth was one language. Now, you got to be careful with the word earth that it uses there. And we're going to point that out, that when the earth was one language, it also lets us know you got to be careful how it says the earth was one language, right? It could also mean the territory was one language or the land was one language, because that means that it's counting a time when a lingua franca, another lingua franca, major lingua franca comes up. So that's going to be majorly important about the lingua franca, how lingua francas work when it connects cultures together. But here we're going to note that they're going to leave. Why are we already seeing other branches, right? Shouldn't they all have one similar language? Well, no. As cultures go and spread in different areas, right? They can have the same language, but it can sound different, right? For example, American English sounds totally different than the English of the British, right? There's certain words and certain phrases that are different, and it just happens with the distance of culture. So that's why when they look at they're obviously speaking a language. So since everybody came from the time of being together after that bottleneck, they have a similar root sound and a similar language. So that's going to help later on when they put a lingua franca so that they can build a language for that. But we also know that they all would link together very close to these areas, especially where we would just talk about the areas where they left from Mount Erech. So it all makes sense. So the languages are definitely tied to the same area, right? They're going to be linking all the way back to their ancient roots. So to their ancient roots, they're going to link all the way back. So that's the time that we talk about was the flood. But let's dive a little more into it. So they go over it, say languages of the world, right? Etymological database, basically the LWED, is part of the Tower of Babel project. So they even got a project called the Tower of Babel, right? Here's that where it is, or I was just showing that right here, right, from this site. So they even call it the Tower of Babel project. So that's what they call it. They call it the Tower of Babel project. So you think they're onto something? You think they are figuring out something interesting, right? They already called a genetic group Y chromosome atom and mtDNA Eve, and now they got basically a Babel project, a project to figure out something of these languages and these keys. But also biblical understanding is going to be important to understand here. That remember, when they all had one language, that language would have still existed before the flood, right? So a lot of those languages, early ties, would have existence before the flood. Let's go a little more deeper into that. So it lets us know that all languages today, right? All the languages today would have ties to one root. So every language that you see today, right, would have early ties. Though now, after many years, the different linguistic changes happen, but apparently they all would have had tied together, right, in one root. You just say that in a simple way. To find the language that would be before Babel, I don't know why I put Babel, it's Babel, right? Before Babel, we would have to find the language that even Noah and pre-flood individuals spoke. So that's what we got to find. For us to find the actual evidence of Babel, we first need to find a language that would have had been almost a uniform language after the people had came through the movements of the flood. So let's take a quick, interesting idea on some people who looked at this concept as well and what they think about it. So I'll show this one right here. This is an interesting highlight.
Living differently in different languages. Comparing cognates, a picture emerged of a family tree. Walking back up the branches of the tree, you could reconstruct the common ancestor. But testing this method in the wild world, the trails of cognates didn't lead back to a single proto-language. No, there were clusters of closely and distantly related languages belonging to separate families. English, Irish, Greek, and even Sanskrit were clearly part of an Indo-European language family. From the South China Sea to the Eastern Pacific, the languages of Austronesia all shared their own common ancestor, and Hebrew, once dubbed the original language, fits snugly among its kin, one twig of an Afro-Asiatic family. It wasn't even the purest or best preserved twig. For example, it wore away consonant distinctions that its relatives, Aramaic and Arabic, kept. Also, change turned out to be something languages were doing naturally, all of the time. Babel still held one intriguing idea over us, though. That original language. See, reconstructions dead-ended several thousand years back. Beyond that, historical linguists started to feel like they simply had nothing to say. Nothing to say, eh? Well, tie your own hands, but you can't hold back a maverick. So you established families and reconstructed parent languages. Well, why not do the same thing again? Compare proto-languages for cognates and build families on top of families. Families are coming together. It's a super family. Enter the late Joseph Greenberg. Classify languages first, he said, then compare and reconstruct. Classify first? Yes, it's called mass comparison. Take a huge number of languages and look for patterns in them, patterns in vocabulary, but also in their typology, the comparative structure of the world's languages. You know, stuff like how many vowels does it have? What's its basic word order? He cast his net wide and caught some huge and controversial superfamilies. Indo-European, Turkic, Mongolian, Japanese, and more belong to Eurasiatic. And this one drew tons of flack, but the complicated languages of the Americas are one happy Amerind family. Then, in the 90s, Merritt Rulin ran all the way. He compared vocabulary from across the globe and reconstructed 27 proto-words. Here it was, our first look at the parent of all living tongues, proto-world.
All right, so a little piece of that. So just like how we was talking about, they have been reconstructing and constructing these genetics, just like how this was talking about. These lines are, as you can see, different. Why would they be different? Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they went different ways and they developed differently. So we're going to also note some things with that. But when do they get that one language? Shouldn't this count as Babel since they have that one language? That's what we got to remember, right? They already had one language when they left out. But by the time of Babel, they're going to do something very important and pinpoint that we have to understand about that event, that they came together and they built a lingua franca first. That's what's going to be important. Not just that they had a language already, but they came together and had one language. And that's going to be very important. And the way that that's worded is going to be important. But as you can see here, they already have one language. But there's going to be also something important to note with that construction. So this is a superfamily. So a superfamily would be just like we have a node. So let's say this was Noah, and let's say this would be Afro-Asiatic, and let's say that would be Shem, and because Shem also makes the Shemites and Shemitic and all that. And let's say we also would have Indo-European or Euro-Asiatic, and that makes Indo-European. That means Indo-European, Indo-Iranian, things of that sort. They would be of one family, but they would be a super family under one, but these different branches of their family. So that's what they actually found out. They actually found out that this is what's going on. Let me show you an example. That
the first sentence ever spoken was somebody telling their
I'm gonna go to here, point this out.
Get stuck in out of nowhere. You know, completely new replacements get stuck in out of nowhere for certain words, stuff like that. So linguists actually think that if you go back farther than 9,000 years, you're not going to find a mother tongue, you'll find a completely different language. No root words, no cognates. But now a team of research says that they've found 23 words that have survived 15,000 years across the 7 oldest variations of language in Europe and Asia. And that means that there was probably a common ancestral language to all of them, one that would link 700 modern languages together. The researchers call it Proto-Eurasiatic. 15,000 years. So potentially someone from the Ice Age could probably understand a little bit of what you're saying if you were talking to them. The same way that you can understand a few words when someone speaks an unfamiliar language to you. So what are the
All right, so you got that. Academically wise, there is indeed evidence that language, right, as soon as they came out of the flood, they would have left out and they would have had evidence of that language. Now, did they spread that language as they went about? Something happened when they got out of the flood. They start having the different divisions of languages, but they would end up coming together at some point. So we're going to talk about that. First, we need to understand this time frame that I was just showing you before we move forward. This is actually going to be the Epi-Paleolithic. And this is actually the pre-Neolithic, right before the Neolithic. And this is what I was talking about. This is right before that flood. This is actually going to be, as it says, just goes on and talks about those ancestral languages, such as that one Startic, something like that. Family is called the Proto-Nestartic, right? It's called the ancient. They got an idea that language goes deeper. So Proto-Nestartic would have been spoken between 15,000 and 12,000 BC, right, in the Epo-Paleolithic period, close to the end of the last glacial period. So that's what we talk about, that flood and everything. Now, I'm also going to show you some interesting ideas on that as well. So Earth was warming as it right, exited the Paleocene, right, which is about, remember that time frame we talk about, the same time frame after 12,000, right? That's going to be that time frame after that basically flood event, right? On measurements, it looks like the temperature is just rising and dropping. And that's why when they look at it, they call it that older or younger Dryas, the major event of the catastrophic Neolithic bottleneck that happens, as well as the mass extinctions that starts happening and the replacement of population. We're going to prove it. We'll talk about the replacement of populations that happen, right? So the glacier retreated and humans started farming at the dawn of a new era. So remember, why is it important that they started farming? Why is that important? Because it's going to transition to Noah and his wine country, right? Remember, Noah had wine. He would be quite evident to be a farmer, just like how the scripture said, right? Noah planted a vineyard. That means he was a farmer, right? That's very important. So academically wise, he would have to be an individual that would come after the Neolithic. So he would be someone who would come after the Neolithic. And we got some evidence of some interesting things that would be about the time of like when wine is introduced, about 8,000 BC. So we're getting right to the nail on the head on that. And we'll also show how that's also converted and everything, because that's also important. But let's continue on, talk a little bit more on it. Let me make sure I point this out. This is just someone that also noted these things as well, right? He's going to point out the same thing, right? That ancient language that's going to link all these languages together and everything. So they're going to get off the ark and everything, and they're going to have a conversation, and they're going to spread quickly across the world. They're going to spread quickly, right? That's going to be something that's kind of important to note. I'm going to go a little more into it. So let me make sure I click this. So this is what we were just talking about, right? We just talk about at that time frame, right? There would have been famines and all types of stuff that would have existed at that time and whatnot. But we know that they did have language at that time, and there was a catastrophic event that we're going to talk about right now because it's important. So they actually call that the dawn of man. They also call it the age of man. That's what they call that, the age of man, right? After that massive flood event, right? They call it the age of men because they expand very quickly and massively, right? So that's actually kind of interesting to know about. So the scientific version of Noah's flood actually starts long before that. So they talk about, remember how we pointed that out when we was going through the scientific information of the flood? It would have been in between the events that would happen to younger, older Dryas and all that. And just to give a interesting highlight, right? I thought this was kind of interesting. I'll just point this out, right? So they say it would have been back during the last glaciation some 20,000 years ago, right? So they talk about evidence for a flood and everything. And then you can see right here, settlement layers suggest that, remember, we're going to talk about Noah and everything at the final result, because what we want to do, we don't want to look for when the flood starts. We want to look for when the flood ends. So when it started, it would look like it's about 20,000 to 12,000 BC. But once it's finished, once it's all finished, it ends up about like 10,000, 8,000 BC. And we'll point that out as we go about it, because we're just starting to get it. But first, we got to point out the pre-flood world, how everything was in the pre-flood world and everything. Well, not. So this just goes over and talks about some things. Noah's is going to talk about an interesting idea, right? An interesting thing that scholars talk about and other people talk about, and we're going to point out as well. In fact, the biblical story is similar to a much older Mediterranean flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Epic of Gilgamesh. So it goes over some things, and it talks about some things that we're going to point out and talk about real fast. Let's go into that. But first, let me point out the last thing I want to point out here. So what does it mean about the last glaciation when it says that? Right? The last glaciation pretty much is like an in-between, right? When they're looking at basically the ground and stuff and looking at the measurement of like the temperature and stuff, it looks all like, as you can see here, like it looks all sporadical. But it's the last bit of time, right? That 12,000, 11,000 last bit at the end event of the younger Dryas, at the end of the younger Dryas. So that last bit of time is when that flood happens. And that actually is going to give that final phase of it all. So that's going to be very important. But that's what they see when they see on the temperature. There was at that time, there was evidence, as I went over before. You got to remember, what would it look like if they was to go back and try to find evidence of a flood? Well, remember, it rained a long time. The temperature would have been very, very sporadical because the clouds in the air, that would have been the first time that it rained, but it would have been a massive amount of rain. And the earth would have basically been shooting out water out of it. And because of the earth cracking open, the temperature would have risen because lava would have came out of the earth. Also, smoke would have came out of earth, adding on to the water that's raining down. So you wouldn't just have a flood. You'll have all types of natural events that come with flooding and with the way that the Bible was explaining how the flood was happening, right? It wasn't just raining, but the earth broke open and water shot out of the earth. That would add lava to that, and all types of different things that would happen. So that temperature gauge makes sense. The way that temperature fluctuates there, it makes perfect sense. So let's look at it something with that. Make sure to understand this last piece that we're talking about, that how that's very similar to something that happens in Mesopotamia. Because now we got to kind of take this, right? That's why right here it says the scientific version of Noah's flood actually starts long before that, right? Dating during the last great glaciation, some 20,000 years ago. This was a time when the earth looked very different and everything. When they talk about, remember how we talked about that 400 feet? So the ocean levels were about 400 feet lower than they are today. Remember we pointed out how 400 feet of water rise within that said younger Dryas and older Dryas event, that waters actually rise 400 feet. That was something that's actually important. But we know that a long time ago, it was also 400 feet lower than it is today. So that's something to actually know a long time ago. But then the water rised, right? That's very important about that rising, not just the water rising, because if the water just rise, then we can say, oh, that's just change of nature. But we also got a bottleneck that happens and a massive extinction of all ancient humans. So that's very important that happens there. So that bottleneck and that flood effect is very important to know about. So it's going to give us some major keys of these events that take place. So, but remember how we just point out that it's very similar to what? The Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, if we kind of work our way to after they get off of the ark, right? Let's go back to our legend. So after they get off the ark, right, you're going to have Noah and his sons that's going to get off the ark, right? They're going to get off the ark and they're going to fill the earth. One of the interesting things is Shem has a son, he has a son, and he has a son. But one of the interesting things about the genealogies of Shem, we got to point out, is one of the sons of Shem that actually, if you look carefully, there's a key factor that's said of one of the sons of Shem. So we're going to read it very closely and carefully to understand it. So it says, the sons of Shem, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. So you see what it's saying there? And it just says the sons of Cush, right? Seba, Havilah, right? Just goes on about them and everything. And it just lets you know a little bit about these sons and whatnot. And then it goes on and tells you right here, right? It says, and Cush begat Nimrod. So first it tells you about these sons that Cush has, says, and the sons of Cush, these, and these. But then it kind of like puts a spacer, and then it hits you with, and he begat Nimrod. Now, what's interesting is the question is Nimrod actually a descendant, as in from the father's line of Shem, or is he adopted by Shem? Or is it just that it would be like a descendant of a female that mixed in with a male of another line, and then he became said as a son of Shem or Cush, right? Or is this Cush, right? That says, and Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Now, this is what's get kind of interesting, because then you look at what could he be? What are some interesting synchronisms of Nimrod and some things? Now, I've seen a lot of interesting ideas. I've seen some from Hammurabi. I've seen some from Sargon. Now, I myself, I have another interesting conclusion to what I believe Nimrod might be, and which also might lead to this understanding here. So we're going to have to kind of take this into the Mesopotamian understanding of what was going on at that time and the ancient times of it. So first, I'm going to show a little video, and I'm going to show a little part of that video that I think is going to set the mood for what we're going to go into. So let's go to something here.
Adtibira, Supar, and Shuruppak have all been found. Therefore, as Sumer, its cities and its citizens have come to light. Not only the deluge, but also events and places from before the deluge have become historical facts. As the Mesopotamian texts claim the deluge destroyed every city upon it, one might well wonder how they remained standing after the deluge. We have to lift away the curtains of time and obscurity in order to reveal the full story of the Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth. It will.
Okay, so you heard that term real fast, Anunnaki. We're gonna come back to that, and we're gonna point out some things with the Anunnaki, and we're gonna kind of point out some things to know about. So remember, now what was the biblical story before Noah? What would have existed in the world before Noah? Now there's two concepts to this, right? You either believe that all of a sudden Cain started mixing with the sons of Ham or sons of Seth and everything. If you're saying the sons of God, or you actually believe what a lot of scholars believe and a lot of the Bible points to is that they were angels that came down on the earth that day, in those days. So, and they had sons. So that means that their sons would have become great men, and they would have been known even by legend to the sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, because they existed still in that time with Noah. So that would have been very important to know that even ancient writings talk about apparently angels coming down. Other ancient external writings, not just talk about a flood, but apparently angels and stuff like that. But let's kind of build a little more on this to kind of see what's going on here.
Will be the ancient manuscripts themselves that will tell the story. Eden's land. As southern Mesopotamia was called in ancient times, Sumer is derived from Akkadian inscriptions about the kingdom of Sumer and Akkad, a geopolitical entity formed after Sargon I, Sharu Kin equals the righteous king, was installed as ruler of Greater Sumer circa 2370 BC. As the kingdom of David split after David's death into the kingdoms of Judea and Israel, the northern portion was affectionately called Shamron, Little Sumer. Based on the Akkadian and Hebrew verb meaning to watch, to guard, the name Sumer signified the realm as land of the watchers or land of the guardians, the gods who watch over and safeguard humankind. The term corresponding to the ancient Egyptian word for gods, Netiru, came from the verb ntr and meant to guard or watch over. According to Egyptian lore, the Netiru came to Egypt from Ur-Ta, the ancient place, and their hieroglyphic symbol was a miner's axe.
All right, so just to kind of get a little insight on this one, I'm gonna come back to it. This is just an interesting insight that talks about some things that were happening in Sumer, and it goes on in some very deep topics. Let me scroll down before we go back to that and point out something that I think is kind of important to point out.
Hi, my name.
And it has to do with, actually, like we had pointed out before, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? I was pointed out earlier, right? The flood story has very similar things to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, Epic of Gilgamesh also has some interesting things when it comes to like genetics and stuff. Let's look at something that's interesting about one of the individuals that apparently, this is why I'm gonna quickly give the summary of this individual, Gilgamesh. Apparently, the story is, now he's actually written on a tablet of, which is basically the Sumerian kings list, which is a list that actually has a list of individuals that some are real kings and some are not real kings. Gilgamesh, he sits in between the kings of the real kings and the fake kings. He sits in between of it. And the reason why is because apparently he's a son of a man from the lands of basically Erech, or not Erech, Erech. And he's from a man in Erech, right? He goes at it with Kish and a couple different areas around there. And he has some interesting similarities to Nimrod, right? He got some very interesting similarities, but being from a man of Erech, probably said that weird, not Erech, Erech, being from a man from Erech, next to the areas of Mesopotamia, and from supposedly a woman who was one of the watchers, one of the angels or something, right? But let me just let you hear a little bit of the family tree of what's said there before we kind of dig in.
Earliest stories about him come from Sumerian poems. In Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, he is Inanna's brother and helps her to drive away the serpent, the Anzu bird, and a demon from a special hulapu tree. As thanks, she gives him a pair of special objects, the names of which aren't completely deciphered but might be a drum and drumsticks, but he loses them. His servant Enkidu travels to the underworld to retrieve them, because apparently Gilgamesh really misplaced them, but as we've seen before, Enkidu gets trapped. Gilgamesh asks him about the underworld and what life after death is like, and that's where the poem ends. There are and he and Enkidu defeating an ogre sent by Enlil, but the most famous is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In it, Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine through his mother Ninsun and 1/3 mortal through his father, the former king of Uruk. Gilgamesh starts the story as a tyrant king, and as punishment, Anu creates a wild man named Enkidu to slay him. Enkidu travels to Gilgamesh and the two men wrestle, but Gilgamesh proves too strong for even Anu's creation. Nonetheless, he's so impressed by Enkidu that the two become friends, rather than the master-servant dynamic of earlier versions. Together they travel to the cedar forest, guarded by Humbaba, the giant with the face of a lion. His roar is a flood, his mouth is death, and his breath is fire. It's only with the help of Utu's blinding wind that the two are able to slay the beast. This daring feat attracts the attention of Inanna, who wants Gilgamesh to be her consort, but Gilgamesh turns her down on account of how her past lovers have been treated. Inanna doesn't take kindly to being spurned by a mortal, and sends down the bull of heaven to slay him, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull and offer it to Utu. While they're resting, Inanna comes down from heaven and stands upon the walls of Uruk to lay a curse upon Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, in a move equal parts impressive and foolish, pulls off the bull's thigh and throws it over the wall, hitting the goddess in the face. He threatens to do the same to her if he ever gets his hands on her, and immediately the two begin bickering. Select Enkidu. Days. Utnapishtim tells him if he cannot defeat sleep, and Gilgamesh returns home to Sumeria empty-handed, and the story ends there, apart from fragments that don't neatly fit within the chronology of the rest of the epic. For instance, the story of Gilgamesh helping Inanna with her tree is on a different tablet, despite the two trying to kill each other. And there's another story in which Enkidu is alive again, only to die again. And that's the family tree of the Mesopotamian gods. Hopefully this acts as a nice crash course to one of the oldest religions in the world and the ways in which the names go from being legendary to being historical. It is therefore...
All right, so let me make sure I point out this part. This part is what I need to make sure I point out. This Sumerian's kings list right here. Right, so we see it on the Epic of Gilgamesh, but let's point out this part real fast so you can understand why I'm showing you this, right? I'm not going to show you nothing for no reason. We're going to reflect back to it. But notice this about the Epic of Gilgamesh, right?
2,000 plus years before humans started to write straightforward history, it's not surprising that all the texts we have about him are quite clearly greatly embellished. That leaves archaeological evidence. Let's start with the Sumerian king list, which has been found in multiple locations, the oldest one dating to around 2000 BCE. Gilgamesh is included on the list, but there are two problems with this source. One, it's still 800 years after Gilgamesh, and two, it clearly includes both historical kings and legendary ones. For example, there is one king who is said to have reigned for 43,200 years, a reign that will surely only be beaten by Queen Elizabeth II, but she still has a long way to go. Interestingly, however, the first king on the Sumerian king list for whom we have contemporary archaeological evidence is a man named Enmebaragesi. And according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enmebaragesi lived at the same time as Gilgamesh. This places Gilgamesh around the exact point on the Sumerian king list where the names go from being legendary to being historical. It is therefore possible, if not probable, that Gilgamesh was in fact a real historical king, even though the stories we have about him are primarily mythological. The earliest...
All right, so you see how now, if you already know this is useful charts, right? They even think the Bible is mythological, right? But this is what is interesting. He sits in between myth and legend. He sits in between if he is a real king or if he is not real, right? Let's kind of go a little bit more into that. So he could be younger than thought. So he could, because some people, there's some writings where they talk about Nimrod exists at the same time as Abraham. Now, I don't think Nimrod existed at the same time as Abraham. Not when he first started reign. Now, Nimrod could have probably aged a long time, right? Just like Noah, but Nimrod could have probably been one of those individuals that supposedly had a long extended age to him, that he could have been living like because remember, Nimrod, if you look at the genealogical record, Nimrod is a direct descendant after Cush. And remember, Abraham is not a direct descendant after Arphaxad, nor is he a direct descendant after Peleg. He's a descendant further down after Terah. So it wouldn't make sense for Abraham to even live at the same time as Nimrod. But if Nimrod lived at the same time as Abraham, then Nimrod had to have something special to him that caused him to live a long time. Now let's go into some interesting ride in on that. Let me show you something that I think is really interesting on this, on why I'm showing you this, right? I'm going to show you why, right? Because there's a lot of support for who could be Nimrod, right? Could it be Hammurabi? Could it have been Sargon? Let me just show you what I think it would probably be and why, because this is one of the best points, I think.
Bible and the Gilgamesh Epic. The Gilgamesh Epic describes the first God is dead movement. In the epic, the hero is a vile, filthy, perverted person, yet he is presented as the greatest, strongest hero that ever lived. Alexander Heidel, 1963, page 18. So that the one who sent the flood will not trouble them anymore, Gilgamesh sets out to kill the perpetrator. He takes with him a friend who is a monstrous, half-man, half-animal Enkidu. Together they go on a long journey to the Cedar Mountain to find and destroy the monster who sent the flood. Gilgamesh finds him and finally succeeds in cutting off the head of this creature, whose name is Huwawa, or Humbaba in the Assyrian version. See Heidel, 1963, page 34, second footnote. Is there a connection with the Gilgamesh Epic and Genesis 10? Note what Gilgamesh says to Enkidu, the half-man, half-beast, who accompanied him on his journey, as found on Tablet 3, lines 147 through 150. If I fall, Gilgamesh says, I will establish a name for myself. Gilgamesh is fallen, they will say, in combat with terrible Huwawa. But the next 5 lines are missing from all tablets found so far. Can we speculate on what they say? Let's try. We suggest that those 5 lines include, but if I win, they will say, Gilgamesh, the mighty vanquisher of Wawa. So why do we say that? Because Genesis 10, verse 9, gives us the portion missing from the Gilgamesh tablets. Those lines include, it is said, Nimrod, the mighty vanquisher of Yahweh. This has to be what's missing from all the clay tablets of the Gilgamesh story. The Gilgamesh Epic calls him Wawa. The Bible calls him Yahweh. Alexander Heidel, speaking of the incident as it is found on Tablet 5, says, all we can conclude from them, the lost lines, is that Gilgamesh and Enkidu cut off the head of Humbaba, or Wawa, and that the expedition had a successful issue, or ending, 1963, page 47. The missing lines from the epic are right there in the Bible. Because of the parallels between Gilgamesh and Nimrod, many scholars agree that Gilgamesh is Nimrod. Continue.
All right, so now also you're probably wondering why out of all of them did I also choose Gilgamesh? Now, he has an interesting backstory. One of the interesting concepts to his story is said how old he is, or how old the existence of all these things were and all that. Let me just show something real fast on this little crash course.
Hi, I'm Mike Rugnetta. This is Crash Course Mythology, and today we're returning to one of the world's favorite texts, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is one of the oldest written stories in the world, and it's a great illustration of Joseph Campbell's monomythic hero's journey introduced last episode. Plus, it has sacred trees, love-struck goddesses, and a fearsome... The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than 4,000 years old. Written versions of the story date back to 2100 BCE, which gives it incredible historical value. For instance, several versions of the Gilgamesh story use both Sumerian and Akkadian names for gods, which shows how the story might have passed orally between the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia. This could also be considered syncretism, when 2 religious traditions combine over time. In this episode, we're going to work from a version of the epic written around 1200 BCE and see how Gilgamesh himself fits into the hero's journey. A fair bit of warning, though.
All right, so you can see he's obviously in the BC time frame. I'm just going to leave this one alone because this one I'm not going to go into it. It's too long. But let's go into the summary on why I'm showing you this. Why I'm showing you this, because this is also important to know. So he may have been older, he may have been younger, right? But let's point out something that's important to know here. So obviously, after Noah had his children, right? So after we seen Noah survive the flood, he had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Shem had Arphaxad. He had his sons, right? His first son, Arphaxad, after the flood. So he had his son after the flood. But we don't know if Ham or Japheth had their sons before the flood or after the flood. Because they could have had sons before the flood and they could have not made it. They could have had sons that didn't make it. Or they could have had waited to after the flood. Now, let's say they did wait to after the flood. Even if he had his direct son of Cush, and then he brought forth Nimrod, that would have been just 2 descendants, and then you would have had Nimrod. But remember, Arphaxad makes another one makes Eber makes Peleg, and Peleg makes a couple till you get Terah, then Terah you get Abraham. So Abraham would exist like we had went over before. He could have been there during the 13th dynasty of Egypt. But Nimrod could have existed during the time of the Sumerians and stuff like that. So Nimrod could have existed there a long time ago, right? And he could have had a long age to him, right? So that's something that's actually important to know on those things. Because remember, that's going to be where Babel rises up early on. So we can see right here as we go over, it says, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, right? Nimrod. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, right? And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, right? So it's letting you know the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and all the way to a lot of the Mesopotamian areas in SHINAR where is, and Akkad, right? So it's got a lot of areas, it's got a lot of covering areas of his kingdom, right? And we know that he had obviously a lot of power in those areas for a long time. So, and then later on, he's going to rise up Babel. So it just lets us know where his kingdoms are and everything, where's locations of his kingdom and where they expand and increase. That's going to be kind of important for noting. But there's going to be a lot of different descendants that come from the lineages of him. So families of Canaan. Most of the lands of Canaan are filled with these groups. Now, does that mean that only the descendants of Ham got to that land? No, it just means that they were first to settle in those lands and name it after their names, so that now later on, when other people come there, they sometimes take in those names. So, like for example, they're going to have Heth here. So Heth actually brings forth lines of like the Hittites and stuff like that. But the land of the Hittites actually is going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Named after their names. So Canaan, right? Even Canaan, as we can see, Canaan right there, lands will be named after their names and stuff like that. So even in Egypt, so that they'll call it the land of Ham, right? So that's going to be very important. So they were the strongest. That means they were there first. But then something happened. Remember, Babel, Nimrod was there when God had spread them. He didn't wait a generation right then and there, right? That doesn't mean that Nimrod has to be buried at Babel. It just means that he had confused the languages and sent them out. So that means that there will be evidence of all of a sudden an event, not a destruction event. There was no wipeout there. We're not looking for a place where there was a war or a siege or some type of fire like Sodom and Gomorrah type stuff. But all of a sudden, evidence that languages start spreading out and diversifying. And remember, we just found out that everyone had a uniformity language before the flood. So everyone had a uniform language. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go about these things. Now we're going to look at the genetics. We're going to look at some of the fossils and stuff and kind of work our way. So again, still from the same concept after the flood, right? We're going to go from the events right after the flood so that we can see what was happening. So remember, before Babel, right before Babel, they're going to settle in some areas. So they're going to be settling areas. And remember, because the flood had happened, it caused these high years. I had pointed out this before on how the flood actually caused a lot of those layers to be layered down, but we're going to proceed with it. So right here, I'm going to point out something that's important to know of the events, right? An upper Mesopotamian location for Babel. So we're going to point out where is Babel. So there's a lot of concepts, like I said, there's a lot of concepts on Nimrod and all those things, right, and whatnot. But I'm going to show you what's I think will be the most academic for this sense. So watch what it says here. Archaeology and biology both suggest that the origin of human civilization and farming began between the Euphrates and Tigris, so the Fertile Crescent. In the region, it just talks about this certain region in Turkey. So let's talk about like basically over here, these little regions. This is where farming has started. And says, for now, we will not be concerned, right? For now, so even as everyone knows, for now, we will not be concerned with radiocarbon dating, right? Because remember, radiocarbon dating is the layers, right? That's what we talk about with how the water layers those things down. If you want to see an interesting video, I'll show you an interesting video on how a scientist did a study and showed how water can show almost the same effect of what we see from looking at layers. It looks almost like a million years, right? 20 minutes of water flow through dirt can look like the same evidence of what you'll see when you look at the world today, right? He did an experiment to show that really what we're seeing today is because the earth had lots of water on it at one point in time, suggesting these sites are 10,000 years old. So just to read that one more time, right? So it just let us know, right? We don't have to be concerned with the radiocarbon dating, suggesting these sites to be 10,000 years old. If we ignore the conventional pretty much dating whatnot, right? Which may be based on basically assumptions, right? Mistakes of assumptions. We find the evidence fit the biblical narrative quite closely. So just to kind of point out what we're saying here, because remember, we're pointing out the time of the Neolithic, and during the transition, while people were settling, right? People were settling in their houses and stuff and putting themselves in certain locations during the Neolithic, right? They'll be settling in these different areas. They'll be coming together and they're going to be building that lingua franca. When is the first lingua franca? The Sumerians. During the Sumerian time, right? That's why I was showing you the Epic of Gilgamesh, all that. Because during the Sumerian time, they're going to build up that lingua franca. And that's why I said the earth was of one language. But it's letting you know that territory, especially that territory with SHINAR, right, was a one language. It was in a lingua franca. So it's going to have all one language, one lingua franca at that time in the lands of Shinar. So that's going to be kind of very important to understand. So it's letting us know a little bit about that on these things to understand, right? So it's giving us that information and whatnot. So that's just something that's, I think, is interesting to take note of real fast before we dive into it. Here's just a copy of basically what that's talking about, right? An upper Mesopotamian location for Babel, right? It's going a little bit of that picture there. So it just goes on and tells us a little bit of that. So this is going to be that PP, as you see it there, PPNA. We're going to look at these time frames and everything. And we're going to go through it and establish, as the people are moving about, they're going to be settling themselves in Mesopotamia and other places, not just in Mesopotamia, but in other places. That's going to be kind of important to note. That first, they're going to be, as we know, from Mount Erech going into different areas, right? They're going to different areas to settle in different areas, right? So that's going to be very important to kind of take note of, that they're going to be settling, right? Before Abraham exists, there lots of things happen. Lots of things happen in times past. So it's very important to know. So you see how these dots right here, they go all the way to Africa. They go to Greece, right? They go to Greece over here. They're going off of Anatolia or modern day Turkey. You can see them on Mount Erech, mountains of Erech, and they go across the lands of right through Iraq, through Iran, and they're going all the way into basically Indian areas, where the areas of modern India is, right? So that's where they're leaving out at. So on some of these islands, this is actually where it's showing like where the people were basically leaving out from, right? And they're gonna be settling down, right? Before they build up that lingua franca and everything. Just gonna point this one out. There's a lot of, I'm gonna put this in the description if you want to see more studies on the groups. We talked about a lot of these groups, Tel Halula, Syria, and other different places. This actually goes over a lot of those different spots. So you can see Tel Halula, Syria would be number 11, which we have pointed out before. That's L2 and L3 there. Tel Halula, Syria. And a lot of groups will be existing in these parts, spreading around. These will be mostly places where people live. So a lot of places where people live, they show a little sample of what the places look like. They would have been settling across these different areas. So that's going to be kind of important to note. And we can kind of see, some major areas where they would have been settled at. Some of those major areas and everything in the Middle East, whatnot. There's a lot of different genetic papers on those things. A lot of different genetic papers on those things. Close that. All right. Just gonna go down. So Near East roots of the Neolithic in South Asia. So just like that time frame was talked about. So after that flood event, now we're gonna see people settling down, becoming farmers, and settling in different areas. So it looks old because they got old culture stuff going on, right? Babel's not there yet. They don't have that lingua franca totally. People are spreading out and languages are becoming diverse, right? So they're gonna have to come together. Remember, it's important to know that Nimrod calls them back to Shinar. And that's what happens later on. They're going to be called back to Shinar, and then they're going to basically come back to the Middle East, and some things are going to happen during the Sumerian culture. So it just talks about here, just farming and everything. Where they go, they spread to Europe. So 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, they spread up to Europe. They spread to all types of different places. I'll show you also the Indus Valley civilization, right? They go all types of different places. So you can see they're going to the Indus Valley civilization, right? From Mesopotamia, they're going to Europe. So you can see they're making some movements. They're changing direction, everything. So early Neolithic sites, 10,000 BC to 3,000 BC, used in our analysis. So that's what this actually is. They're letting you know this is the time frame we was looking for, 10,000 BC to 3,000 BC and everything. So a lot of different sources on these. If you want to look at like the genetics, we already got a paper that I'll show the genetics fast, but usually you have to go through each one of these independent papers. But this is a list, as you see here. Everything that you see here is an independent paper. I'm just going to keep scrolling. You can see there's 16 so far. There's 20 on this page. And it basically talks about different independent studies of that Neolithic. There's more, but this is a great example of like finding like the genetic origins of the Minoans, dairy farming in Europe. It's got other relationships in Eurasia. It got all types of different spots that it goes over. It goes over Arabia, right? You can see one in Cyprus and the Aegean and everything. We're gonna skip this one because we don't need this right now. This one just goes over in the Fertile Crescent. So you see, you just click on and it's got all types of stuff. So this one probably just need to be updated, but they got mostly different sites. So you can see Near Eastern roots of the Neolithic in South Asia and whatnot. And it goes over some of those, just like we just talked about. But we're going to point them out on some of the grouping. If you want to see what was all basically moving around in these upper areas, we need to take away the ones pre-flood and anything that is going to be before 4,000, 3,000. So let's take a look at that real fast, just to know what was around during this time. So this will be the time frame. We also need to use this. So not the things before the flood and not the things that are going to be after Babel. So today we're going to be looking at events leading up to Babel. So getting off the ark, leading up to Babel and everything. And they look like exaggerated years because of that flood. That's just what we see here. And you can see right here, this will be some of the early cultures of what would have been around. So this will be the Yap groups. Everything on here, everything that you see right here is the Yap groups. And we're also going to connect this. We're also going to connect this by the evidence, by the actual papers, because we're going to get evidence of groups that leave here, going over here. As we know, that some went over here. So you can see these groups. These will be these ancient Yap groups that will be settled here because basically, how you say, right after the flood, right directly after the flood, you would have basically Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their descendants settling in a different area. So this will be more the like Yap groups. We point out that the Yap group is the DE Yap groups, right? So you can see right there, look at that DE Yap group. And that DE Yap group is actually going to be Shem. Over here, we can actually see more of the descendants. Looks almost the same, but there's a little difference here. You're going to see more of the descendants of, I would say, more of Japheth. And early on, they basically went out and they went into Eurasia very early. We're also going to point out what language they picked up and everything. So you'll see a lot of those IJK groups, like IJR, which is from K and everything. And it also got those genetic papers to them. So we're not just looking at, something just thrown on there. These are all individual papers put on one. So that's why I went to this, because as you can see, just imagine trying to find each one of these papers, because each one of these are indeed individual genetic papers charted on the graph, and they're ancient. So that's also important to know that we're using ancient genetics, where really the people were at that said time frame. Now, again, understand the exaggeration on these things and whatnot. Now, I'm not going to do like a major breakdown of each one of these. I did a breakdown of the Ham, Shem, and Japheth groups individually. So today, just more of a summary of all the groups together to know what was going on. But what it looks like, just from this whole picture here, it looks like a lot of the descendants of Japheth early on, they had basically diversed into the north very quickly and spread into the north. And some of them did go down into basically Africa, especially the ones over here. These probably going to be some of the groups that go down. But this group right here is actually Ham. We have pointed this out that A and B groups are the Hamitic groups. So this is going to have some A and B groups down there. They usually have one of the biggest things that I need to point out here is that the men are going to be A and B, D&E and CF. So A and B for Ham, D&E for Shem, CF for Japheth. And those are going to, no matter where they are, it doesn't matter where they are on the map, they're going to always be Ham, Shem, or Japheth. So it doesn't matter if you find a Japhethite in Africa or a Japhethite in Europe. When I say Japhethite, son from Japheth. So Japhethite So you know how that goes. That's a son from Japheth or a son from Shem, Shemite, right? Or Hamite, right? Son from those individuals. Understand when I say this, no matter where they are, that's basically what we're going to find out, that as long as we connect them monophylactically, we can find out the separation of these groups. But we mostly find a lot of those lines also starting to mix. One of the interesting things about Japheth, of his line, he starts to mix with a very certain group of women. Now, it doesn't matter which men start mixing with this group of women when I say this. And I'll point this out a little later when I talk about Babel and everything. Something happens and there's women that go south and they develop basically darker pigmentations, and there's women that go north and they develop lighter pigmentations. And a lot of men from no matter what group, if they mix with that type of woman, they would start to blend in or with that culture. They'll start to mix and become one with that culture. It can also happen to the woman, right? It all depends on what genetics take dominance. So sometimes let's say like a E group, a A group, or R group goes up here to Europe. Maybe like the groups that are called bell beakers, start mixing with them. Maybe mix with some H groups, some high up H groups, or some K groups and stuff like that into DNA. And they might start looking lighter skin, right? Unless they go down here in this area where, as you can see, there's an African T group down there, and there's also a K group that's on it right there in the areas of Africa. And that's going to be technically said almost close to 4,000 BC, but that's obviously with exaggeration. But that's going to be very important to understand that this one would be a group that, as is evident, it had to migrate down there, right? It had to migrate, as all these groups had to migrate down there. So it just lets us know about some of these groups that are going to settle down there, even with Eurasian lineages like U6 with this E group, that would have a Eurasian mixture there. So you'll start to see different groups mix, but they're still going to be what they're going to be. Now, the reason why all this is important is because taking note that in this time frame, we're seeing E groups, we're seeing CF groups, we also see A and B groups and everything. That's something we could also point out. But let's kind of push forward on this, move a little forward on it. So that just lets you know like some of the lines that will be settled up and around these areas. So they were basically coming out, settling around mainly in these areas and also over here. And here they start spreading throughout the whole world, start spreading throughout all types of different places. So that was something that did happen. Now, one of the earliest sites is this one in the areas of Iran. So you can see Iraq there and whatnot, and Iran. And then you got this Al-Kosh. I don't know how you say that, Al-Kosh, something like that. It's a small tell. A tell is pretty much a hill that's built upon itself, right? It's like a cake, right? All the layers have something in it, right? And it's basically built, is on the area of Iran, but it's a very, very early site. Some say about 9,000 years ago, things like that. So it'll be in the transition of the Neolithic going into Chalcolithic or not. And that would be an early site, and that would be right around this area, just so you can see there. And that's this area is important because this is usually like an area where if they're settling early at, that's going to be a hot spot for like later growth in the biblical narrative. So you can see, just like we just point out, this little area where they be first settling, right? They'll be first settling these areas and whatnot. Let's close this and get a little into it. So it says circa 8,000 BC, the earliest domestication of sheep and goats occurred, right? At Al-Kosh, right? In southern Iran. So that's what we were just looking at, the earliest one and everything. 8th millennium BC, the earliest known clay vessels, right? Modeled human and animals, whatnot, right? So their beginning of their idol worship and everything started already. So right after that, they're already worshiping idols. And then they were over here making pottery and everything. And then comes Susa and whatnot. So they point out, this is at the this museum. This is what they're pointing out. They're saying basically, beginning in the 8th millennium BC, agriculture communities formed in Western Iran. So you can see what's going on there, like they're pointing out. So in Iran, they're going over some areas. So Iran, indeed, right? Just going over some major things that were happening in that area of Iran, right? So a lot of things that started building up in this area, because this is going to be the hot spot for things that rise up in this area, right? So process and demographic dynamics of the Mediterranean Neolithic size, basically 7,000 to 5,500 BC, right? And it's just pretty much what it is just giving some interesting insight on how farming was taking place there in these time frames, right? It's just basically letting us know some interesting things. I'm just going to read something that I think is kind of interesting, because it's going to lead us to Iran and Anatolia. That's when we're going to start to get kind of that early rise after the PPN groups, the pre-pottery Neolithic groups and everything. But it just talks about, let me point out a decent highlight on this. Basically just talks about some things that are happening. I'm going to just skip this one because this is just talk about little highlights that I got a little more, we'll go a little more deeper into it. But it just talks about some things like the first goats and sheeps, the names of them and everything, the type of breed, because also you got to know that they're gonna have different animals, right? So different types of animals. So they're gonna have, like in Europe, they're gonna have a lot of horses, but in the South they're gonna start getting a lot of donkeys and stuff. So there's gonna be a kind of a difference of culture movements, and this is all before Babel, so pre-Babel movements. So they're gonna be settling around. So this is kind of like those first generation groups kind of moving around, settling around and everything, everyone having their kids and everything, making the place look very filled, right? But this is the population that replaced that other population, whatnot. But they're still going to be in a transition of also hunter-gatherers. As we see right here, Cyprus was evidently being exploited by hunter-gatherers, right? In the 11th and 10th millennium BC and everything. But then what we've seen a later change of that farming, right? But the transition to farming, and just pretty much goes on to talk about when the farming was introduced there, it started to change the environment. It started to change some things there. We're going to kind of point that out to what happens here. So I got one that's a little better. So first, let's point out something here. So you see this little area here. That's where we're starting at. The reason why I was pointing out and showing you how everyone was going out and they was going to these different areas, because it also matches the movements of like material. So as humans move, especially farming, they're going to move different material. So this is a map showing the approximate centers of origin of agriculture and its spread in prehistoric history. So Fertile Crescent, starting there, the Fertile Crescent, the earliest, remember after the flood, the Younger Dryas, all that. You can see that would be after that event. And then all of a sudden, you're going to get it moving all the way to China. So 9,000 BP, moving all the way to China. It's going to then take off to, as you see, China. And then some reason it goes to Africa. So it goes to China, and then it goes to Africa. So this is going to Africa. And then also this is going to Africa. So it's going to Africa. So going to some of the areas of Africa, also through Guinea and stuff like that, to the islands over here. So that's going to be after China, then these areas right here, right? So filling up those areas. But they also end up going into, there's evidently someone that goes overseas or something and travels, takes it to Mexico, to New Mexico. And it makes sense, because if there was a flood and they built the ark, there'll be great sailors and great fishermen and great on boats. So early on, they should be great on boats. So it went to America, South America, and then Africa. So very important there. That's going to be important to note. And then some other places, right? So that's going to be the movements of that farming and everything. So we're going to start with the PPNA, is when they're going to start settling in area. So they're going to come out of Ark, right, after the flood. And now they're basically settling in different areas, replacing different cultures. So they're replacing lots of different cultures, right? This is the event we was talking about that happens after the Younger Dryas, right? As we right there, right? It's happening in the midst of the older and Younger Dryas, right? So that's going to be very important to understand. So they're settling in different areas, right? Jericho and Iran and all types of different places that they're going to be settling in. And they're going to be basically establishing themselves in different areas around the world, right? So that's going to be kind of important to note what happens there, right? And then as they settle and they establish themselves, it's important to know that there's going to be some earlier societies. Let me make sure I point this one out. Like this one. This was the one that we were talking about earlier. So right after the Fertile Crescent, it goes to this area of China, 9,000 BP, which is actually this area at this river. I don't know how you 100% pronounce that in China. So you can see right there. So this river right here, just like it says, right? It went to this river and the Yellow River, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, pretty much. And then it settles around these areas. And you can see 9,000 BC, 5,000 BC. So they're really expanding early on. They're expanding. As soon as they get off the ark, they take off and they're expanding in the world. Now, we don't even see that they have language yet. That's one of the biggest things. We don't see written language yet, right? That's one of the biggest things is that these don't have that new language that comes in with these groups. So that's going to be very important. But these are going to be earlier groups and everything. They're going to be very early groups. But not yet did they pick up that later lingo franca and everything. So they obviously go all over, right? There's that civilization that we was talking about. It's like an early, what's the word I'm looking for? Early pre-Chinese civilization and everything. It's going to be very early on. It's going to settle in different areas of China and whatnot. Just to point that out, that these are basically real societies. There's other studies on them. So Neolithic China and everything. And they basically just, talk about what was happening there. So basically, just like how we was pointing out in the areas of China, some groups were settling there and some developed to later groups. So the first ones that settled there, just like how we was pointing out, like this one, we was pointing out this early one that was settling there, they would later just become later groups in those areas. So not all of them returned. So one of the biggest thing, not everyone can go and build on Babel. So not everyone returned to SHINAR because that wouldn't make sense for everyone to be at one place exactly. But it would make sense if it was a headquarter and everyone's heart was set there and stuff like that. And we're going to point that out. But we do know that everyone early on were spreading across the world. It's a little more, right? When we're talking early on, we're talking all across the world. So farmers and their languages. So now this is where it's going to get kind of interesting about their languages and everything. So when did they start developing these languages and everything? So Babel is happening. Babel, the interesting thing about Babel is that the exact legend or the exact building of Babel could have been built on, and finding the exact origin foundation might be completely hard, right? But we know that there's evidence of its existence, is what we know. And that's going to be very important to know. But first, we got to match some of the languages and evidence of that. So farmers and their language, the first expansions. So the first expansion. So again, the earliest expansions on those things and whatnot. So it's going to give us kind of an idea on their movements, which I got to highlight right here. The researchers found that 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, two populations of hunter-gatherers in Western and Eastern Europe evolved along independent paths. So that's going to kind of that's why we got that diversity. We got the East Asians and we got the Western Asians. We got the East Europe and Western Europe. So it's going to make a major diversity, major difference. It's really interesting when you think about it, because a lot of people are realizing that a lot of people in America, they're not that far genetically related to like Europeans. People in America, you take their genetics, a lot of them are very identical to people in like China and stuff, who ones on the other side of Bering Strait. So a lot of people over here, if you go over, will be connected to people over here, highly related to people over here. So a lot of people over here relates over here, and even over here being related to over here. But let's go about that, how we should go about that, right, with the sources. So it just goes on with the hunter-gatherers and everything. Between 8,000 and 7,000 years ago, closely related people began appearing in Germany, Hungary, Spain, the influx of Middle Eastern farmers. Hunter-gatherers basically continued in Russia and Eastern Europe until about 6,000 years ago, when this group is actually a group that we have pointed out directly before. I need to open up a note here to point out that dive on this to point this out. And I'll look at, while this is open, I'll look at that real fast. It's a great question. I take it that you also looked into the story that Plato said about the destruction of Atlantis, suppose the flood that Noah mentioned. That's an interesting concept. Now, the reason I didn't use Plato, I didn't use Plato, I didn't use Josephus, I didn't use a lot of first century historians, because what I wanted to do was more use primary sources, and Plato wouldn't technically be a primary source. He would be, what's the way I could put it? He would be great for like history of his time, but he probably wouldn't be great for like BC time frame, because he didn't exist in the BC. He would have a great opinion towards it, but I think his opinions wouldn't be too I wouldn't take it the same way that I would take like something that's found in BC time frame. But we did look a little bit at that. What they call it, and melt water for prey. Yep. And ice age, that's right. Yep. And that's basically what we were pointing out of the flood, is that because of the influx of the temperature, that melt water basically is what caused that flood. And also that catastrophic bottleneck. But there is flood stories all across the world. And I'm gonna point that out too, that the development of language is actually a better source, BC time frame. I'm talking, there's a lot of sources in BC time frame during the development of language where all types of cultures will talk about a flood around the world. And we'll point that out. So right here, the Yamna culture, and basically they emerged on the north of the Black Sea. These people herd cattle and other animals. So the Yamna culture is actually an Indo-European culture, mostly. And these people herded cattle and other animals and buried their dead in earthen mounds called kurgans. So kurgans, who had kurgans, right? The Scythians and stuff, right? Just to kind of show that. Right, kurgan. Right, the Scythians and stuff, right? The kurgans and all that. That's what were mounds that they were burying their leaders in and whatnot. But the Scythians were doing that. So the Scythians, they were the ones doing it. So they were in an Indo-European group that were actually burying their groups in these areas, which is kind of interesting to note. Let me make sure I open up this here, because I knew I would need this. Let me make sure I pull it up. As let's see, now this would be good to open. So let's make sure I open it. I'll just type it down. All right. So we talked a little bit about the Indo-European origins and everything, and where they came from and how those replacements had happened and whatnot. So it talks about that Yamna culture right there. So Yamna culture would have been in that center area there. So they would have been that group there where a lot of different cultures would have came from. So we was pointing that out with the PIE expansion, whatnot. So that's something that we had went over. So, but it does let us know that those Indo-European culture practices were being done very early on. So that's going to be kind of important to note. So it lets us know basically some migrations from the east. So corded ware people. So you can see right there, just to point out this picture here. So you see that Yemna and the corded ware. So herders and their language. So they say that from this area, the herders went out. So you see how we just verified a couple different things just already. We've seen that they left from the Middle East and then they went to Europe, especially the Caucasus Mountain. And then it just let us know about the corded ware groups. Ancestors of many modern Europeans have genetic links to Yemna herders who swept westward from the steppe about 4,500 years ago. Yemna may have spoken the mother tongue of Indo-Europeans. So now we're noting that group and their family kind of make that direction and move, right? So we're seeing a language, a major language. Remember those languages that were all one. We're seeing a branch of those languages develop, right? That doesn't mean that Babel happened yet, but that means that now languages are starting to become isolate. So up until the 1980s, linguists and archaeologists embraced variation of the steppe, basically hypothesis, for the origin of PIE or Proto-Indo-European, proto meaning origin of the Indo-European branches, right? And they just say that basically, I'm just going to skip a little down, that they talk about proposed early farmers of Anatolia. So in this area here, because this is actually what happened is that, remember, they was over here. Then some made their way on this corner here. A lot of them start farming, and then they moved up here. They also moved over here, but then they swept this way, right? And then that's what they're talking about in Anatolia, so present-day Turkey. And they say that they brought basically, as you see right here, and the Middle East spoke this ancestral tongue. So we see that their culture and their language is going to move and brought it with them as they expanded both east and west about 8,000 years ago. Signs of this mass migration of farmers out of the Middle East show up in the genomes of living and ancient people boasting the so-called Anatolian hypothesis. So it's saying that the Anatolian hypothesis makes sense. It makes sense. So you see how the groups, they are going to be leaving this area of the Levant and kind of going into these areas. But first, we're linking those Indo-European groups, but we also going to link other groups. So they came from this area here. Just to kind of point this out, what's going on here. So this is going to be the origin of the proto-languages and everything. So we're going to talk about the proto-languages and where did they end up at. Now, if we look carefully, there are some numbers here, and it's going to give us certain languages. It's going to give us Afro-Asiatic. So one Afro-Asiatic, so you can see right there. And these little areas here, Afro-Asiatic, when it went down into Arabia, it also when it went down into the areas of Africa. So Afro-Asiatic would have went downwards. And number two, you can see Elam Dravidian. So Elam Dravidian, you can see obviously some stretching out, or rather two right there, Elam Dravidian. So Elam and Dravidian would have had some interesting ties right there. And you also would have had Indo-European. So Indo-European would have right there. That's why they say the Anatolian hypothesis, because it would have started off over here and then it would have went out into different areas from here. So it would have branched out, becoming the different branches of Indo-European and Indo-Iranian. So that's something that's important to know of. And then it just talks about these other families. But what's important to note here is that it all makes sense that they all come from, right? And even the genetics of animals, because we know that the certain genetics of the animals that are related, they're going to start around that area. But the main thing we want to focus on is that this is where they came from these areas. So just like the biblical narrative talks about, it's not that the languages started all from random places. They all started around the same area, started to branch out. So they have a lot of evidence of all being around each other, right? So that does support that early movement of those groups and whatnot. So you can see how they're going out. A little more detail on it. You can see right here, if we just pinpoint Afro-Asiatic, you can see right after that flood, Afro-Asiatic would have started rising up. And then we see the Afro-Asiatic branches kind of make a little difference. You got Omic later on, right? Those branches are going to come later on. But you're going to see that Afro-Asiatic will be a totally different family than your Indo-European. You can see right here, it shows us some of the movements of them, of the AA groups, the Afro-Asiatic groups. So Afro-Asiatic does make the East Semitic, which is Akkadian and stuff, but it also makes these other groups, right? The Etho-Semitic or South Semitic, things like that, and Omic and Chadic and things like that. So those families are going to be one family, right? But they're going to be mostly moving down Arabia and Africa, right? So that's going to be kind of important to take a note of these movements of these groups. So this just goes into some of the information of them, whatnot. We kind of just show that. So indeed, those languages are going to be basically showing separations of families, different families and everything. And we can kind of see those movements if we look carefully on the genetics. You can see that they would have had obviously some areas in the Levant and everything, but they also go down. They would go down and they go into the areas of Yemen. We also have evidence of this line going into areas of Yemen, and then it goes down into areas of Africa. So that's something that's also important to know, that it will go down into these areas, right? So that's very important, into these areas as well. That's why Afro-Asiatic is actually going to be a language that is in the upper area, but mostly on the southern area of Arabia and Africa. So that's something that's important to know for Afro-Asiatic. As you can see there, going to the areas of Ethiopia and to areas of Africa, but also in areas of Arabia. So that's very important to know. You see the Omic right there, but Omic goes down into areas of Africa, Omic. So Omic starts in Arabia and goes down into Africa. You can see that, just to make sure, because that's one we point out that left from the Natufian groups, came out, went down this area, right? So that'll be right after that flood event. Some groups going down there. So very, 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 very important stuff. I think it's important. So back to what we were just talking about. Here's an interesting idea on some Jewish thought, right? When you think about Ham, Shem, and Japheth and all that, here's just an interesting highlight on some of those things that I think is kind of important to include. So this is what they say. The Anatolian hypothesis suggests that speakers of PIE, or Proto-Indo-European, lived in Anatolia, mostly modern-day Turkey, during the Neolithic period, 10,000 to 4,000 BC. So that's why we was looking at that time frame. For their Indo-European language spread into Europe and Asia, right? Minor around 7,000 BC. So you can see right there. So they say indeed Indo-European doesn't just leave Anatolia, but it goes to Europe and Asia, at least from that earliest time frame right there, even into the movements of reaching there by 7,000 BC. They then split into three major clades: Indo-European languages in Europe, Dravidian languages in Pakistan and India, and Afro-Asiatic languages in the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa. Now, obviously, that's important to know. It's just letting you know, like we know, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, right? They're going to have major branches that's going to separate, and they're going to have these different languages. Now, if you know, I'm going to do a separate study on Ham and kind of point out some things of his language, because those early groups that were in Africa right here, these early groups, they actually had a click language. That's actually something they had. They had an early language that goes very far back that I got to go into another time. But they had a click language. So you can see these deep groups that will be down here. So they will be very deep in Africa, but they will be groups that will be settled over there, unlike some of the Eurasian groups that will be up here. That would have some of those, as you see right here. We'll get an idea of who are those Indo-European groups. So some of these Indo-European mcDNA groups, and the Y chromosome of how you say Indo-European lineages of Y chromosome usually. So you see these G's over here, all these G's that will be in Anatolia, and because GHIJK would be one, GHIJK would have been one. So there's G right there. They would have been one. You also see, so CF, right? CF, will be Indo-European and everything. So you can see that G that went up to the north, We just seen a G up there on one of these. I just clicked. You got some Y-DNA-I. That's an Indo-European group. IJK is Indo-European. So it makes sense for like where we find them. And just like the paper say Indo-European with North. And a lot of these papers actually point out that fact of what we just reading. Like as we see that G, remember that was in Anatolia. You got some H groups. Some of those go to India. But remember India and those languages, Indo-European, Indo-Iranian, and even Dravidian, all those ones over there have some early ties. There's a G and a C group. You can see just by looking at this paper what's going on here. So parallel ancient genomic transit reveals complex population history in early European farmers. So remember we talked about those European farmers. So the genetics of the farmers and their language, right? That's why I was looking at the movements of those farmers and their language to kind of get a good understanding on where they were kind of positioning themselves and settling themselves, because these are important things to know about, because farming also is accompanied by a lot of language movements and settlements, but not language like how we know it today, like written language in the way that we have it. Not a lot of written language at this time. So they could have easily been still speaking two languages, and that first language could have been that major language that tied a lot of them still together. So that's why they still branching onto one ultimate language. I'm gonna skip this one. This is just some information on pretty much when how you say I'll just show a piece of it. It's just how 5,000 years ago, how you say this? Around five. How you say it? Pretty much Egypt end up. You'll see it. You'll hear it. You'll hear it.
Now let's fast forward to around 5,000 years ago, where there is evidence that donkeys were domesticated and used as beasts of burden and as a source of meat in Egypt. This Egyptian stone carving on the left dates back some 5,000 years and clearly shows donkeys looking much like the donkeys of today.
So that's the first animal that actually went into Africa, the donkey. How do we know that? How do we know that that's the first animal that actually went into Africa? Let me actually show you something real fast that I think is kind of interesting to know. We had talked about this before when we talked about pretty much every animal in Africa today has migrated there recently, right? Remember we talked about that bottleneck and everything, and then what happens with the bottleneck? There was a mass extinction, and now think about it. If all the animals left the ark, what would that bring evidence of? That all those animals in that Neolithic bottleneck had to fill up the whole earth, right? And guess what? We got evidence of that exact fact, that pretty much animals are going to be very important to note. Let me point something out here of some of the earliest migrations and stuff that I think is very important. Let me just go to one here, right? So you can see right here, look, it says most genetic studies on modern cattle have established a common origin for all pretty much certain breeds, right? Pretty much cow breeds in the Near East during the Neolithic transition about 10,000 years ago. Remember we talked about that? What happened at that flood event? What happened at that flood event? That was a catastrophic wipeout. And we know that almost every animal can be established as being basically replaced because there was a giant global bottleneck, right? That's very, very important actually to note what happened there. So you can see right here, I'm going to read this highlight here from this little paper here. It's going to read something about what we just was talking about. It says here, about the animals that we was just going over. So it's going to be from this little highlight, right? Watch what it says here. I want to just read a little bit right here. As humans expanded from the Fertile Crescent, right? Remember, we found out that was the starting place throughout most of Eurasia, right? Those cows, the terrain cattle, settled with them. So remember, they moved with the farmers and everything. They reached the Aegean with early farmers in the 7th millennium. So not only did their language move, but the animals were moving. 7th millennium BC. The Zabu cattle are native to the Indian continent. From there, they spread to Iran and Iraq, 3000 BC. So you can know that they would have moved around, right? And everything. It says both subspecies are evident today in Africa. So it's letting you know both of those are in Africa, right? When and how they were brought there is a matter of debate, right? Some contend that the terrain cattle arrived in Africa 7,000 to 5,000 BC, right? Notice how none of these are millions of years old anymore because they replaced all the older cattle. The earliest evidence of Zebu in Africa comes from circa 2,000 years old site from Kenya, right? So it lets you know that's going to be the earliest evidence there because that was a massive replacement that happened in Africa. So this is actually one that we talked about when we talked about lots of animals were placed, other animals, right? Let me find one more I want to put out here. I got it on this one. Oh, I'll just look it up. I'll show you this one real fast. I think this is kind of interesting to note. This little highlight, if I have it right here. Point it out real fast. Because, like I said, the donkey was one of the ones that replaced lions in Africa. Watch what it says right here. It says African domesticated animals, with the exception of the donkey, all came from the Near East. So that means that all the animals in Africa came from where? The movements after the flood, right after the flood. Some 8,000 years ago, cattle, sheep, goats came south. So at the same time, all the animals in Africa was replaced. And at the same time, all of Africa's animals were replaced and refilled at the same time. And goats came south to Sahara, which was much wetter than today. So you see what's going on there? It talks about the grains and everything and whatnot that came down there as well. So what domesticated animals would be new in the areas of Africa? All of them. All came from the Near East. So they would have all migrated into Africa, right? So just like even if we look at the origin of the donkey, right? Because remember, even with the donkey, note the origin of the donkey though. Unlike horses, little was known about the origin of the domestication of donkeys, right? They did a study just recently. This is actually, I'm gonna show you, this is just literally from this year. Genome of modern and ancient donkeys, right? They basically sequenced genome of modern and ancient donkeys and found evidence of an Eastern African origin over 7,000 years ago, right? See what's going on there? Just letting you know, also, it got lineages in Africa and Eurasia. But you can see right there, this just came out 2022, right? If I recall. Yep, September 8th, 2022, and everything. And talk about the domestication of the donkey and everything and whatnot. But as we see, archaeologists' evidence, remember we just talked about that? Archaeologists have evidence of what? That Egyptians had those donkeys and everything and whatnot. So that's very important to know. And also, who was in Egypt in the Neolithic? What group was in Egypt in the Neolithic? I already pointed out before, it was A-M13. It lets you know that the oldest group in that land of Africa was A-M13. All right, we can point that out on the source, genetic source that verifies that. And that's the group that we said was Hamites, right? That would be Mizraim and whatnot. That would be earliest groups in Egypt, right? So they're going to be settled there. So they're riding that donkey, right? It's got some strength to it to carry luggage. So donkeys are bred a certain way, different than horses, right? One's for strength, one's for speed, and whatnot. But there it is, right? Right there. And here's the direct study, right? Genomic history and global expansion of domestic donkeys. And as you can see, this was 2022, right? And it lets us know, obviously, the donkey was an individual that would have been there 7,000 years. Notice that all these things are happening about the same time frame, right? That's why I'm showing these years, because these events are happening about the same time frame. But one thing for sure we are recognizing, that every animal, right? Let's go back up a little bit, right? And now we got the origin of the donkey, right? And now we also know that all animals came from the Near East that are domesticated, that moved into the areas of Africa. That's very, very important, because it's going to give us key information. That was from this right here. This little piece of information. So ancient and traditional agriculture, pastoralism, and agriculture societies in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see what's going on there, giving us a very important key understandings of those areas, that pretty much every animal that came down there, right, was actually from Eurasia. So that's important. That lets us know that, as it says right there, as African domesticated animals, with the exception of the donkey, that we also verified that the donkey also would have been domesticated and moved down there relatively recent, all came from the Near East, right? Very, very, very important. Very, very important. As it goes over that, 8,000 years ago, cattle and sheep and goat came south to the Sahara, which was much wetter than it is today. So they would have went down there at the same time as the spread of these groups filling the earth, right, after the flood. So they're going to be basically settling around and everything. So that's something that's very interesting and uniform. Very interesting and uniform indeed. Let's go a little more down to it, right? So this is just giving us, again, harmony of the whole earth, how the whole earth was basically, things were happening at the same time and whatnot. But first, before we move further, right? Because we also know that indeed, like I said, there's a difference between where the donkey is. So we know the donkey was in the lands of Egypt and also in the south and in Africa and everything. Other animals were down there, but the horse was in the north. So let's just go over here and talk about, obviously, the horses in Anatolia and the Caucasus, because remember, that's where Indo-European was, Anatolia and the Caucasus, because that's actually what Scythians, remember, they were burying themselves in those domes. They actually are going to become some of the earliest Indo-European groups, and they also are masters of horses, right? So based on basically some of the samples and everything, all the way to 8,000, right, BC, whatnot, they obviously got some of the horses and whatnot. And pretty much, what they know is that they basically know that some of the horses in Anatolia are different breeds than the ones in Eurasia. But that just means that as they keep on bringing generations, they're going to have different lines of them. Basically, this is what it's saying. Thus, our study provides the first evidence showing that Anatolia was home to a genetically distant population of wild horses, which, based on zoological findings, were widely exploited during the Neolithic and Chalcolithic period. So it's letting you know that the wild horses in Anatolia were then taken in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic time frame and made into rideable horses, domesticated horses. So they were taking wild horses that they had got off the ark and said, you know what, these look like some great animals we can use, and said, let's turn them into horses we can use. So they found them at a couple different sites, as you can see here, are represented of these wild Anatolian horses. So you can see that's going to be very important. It also lets us know that some of those breeds, so here's an interesting picture right here I'm going to point out. Also, before I move on from that, I point out this little source here. What was that? Let's talk about those horses. Because language is also important too. I'm going to point out why is this important? Because they had the horse, they're going to have certain languages only to horses. That's going to be kind of important when we point out some things of these cultures and everything, verify these cultures, and that these things are happening at the same time, and it is happening after a massive flood event and filling the world up, right? So you can see archaeologists, and pretty much they talk about, I'm gonna just jump down, when they talk about these herd animals, specifically cattle, sheep, and goats and everything. It just talks about when they're going to focus on the diet, remember, of the groups in Yemna, the Yemna groups. It says horse remains also appear basically in some of those sites and whatnot. And they basically, they don't know if they were hunted or domesticated and everything. But it says the middle late Bronze Age transition saw a swift to greater horse exploitation and chariot use. So that's something we know indeed, that they were basically causing them to be domesticated and everything. But basically, it lets us know that the sites of those basically horses and animals expand outwards. Pretty much what it's saying here. But here's what we want to look at is when the languages of these horses are used. So you can look at the Hittites and everything, what they were saying for horses and everything. Their words match with the Korax's cultures and other cultures all around. But this is what's important. Here we apply a west-east, basically, connection of root words, right? Of some of the Indo-European root words of some of the ancient languages dated to around 4000 BC. And basically what they found out, I'll just show you right here. What they found out was up to 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. There's a lot of evidence, especially like between 4,000, 3,000 years, of these languages rooting together and having very similar phrases in many different Indo-European languages, like the corded ware culture, right? They're going to have some similar languages to their wording of the horse and everything. And other cultures are going to have a lot of ties. But basically, as you can see, it's a lot of Indo-European languages, Armenian, Greek, right? All types of languages that later on still have close derived languages to their ancient Indo-European counterparts. Because they were riding horses, they will have names for their horses, right? So different ones will have different phrases for their horses, but they all link together to an ultimate node, pretty much. It all pretty much shows that they're from that Indo-European branch, long story short. So I'll show you that real fast. So just talk about those parallels and everything. So steppe homeland of Indo-European favored by pretty much that, how we looked at that approach, but pretty much it's just showing us some of that archaeological and linguistic parallels, right? So that's what this was talking about, some of those different parallels of these groups and everything. So that's why it does support the Anatolian origin going outwards into Europe for like Indo-European movements. So that means like Japheth family going from Anatolia outwards into other places. So it would look something like this. So it was starting out over here, going out into these cultures here, then diversing. So around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, people with ancient ancestry from the Caucasus, right? Basically the blue, usually the blue, moved west into Anatolia and north into the steppes. Some of these migrants may have spoken ancestral forms of Anatolian and Indo-European languages. So what did they speak? We don't have the writings, but they know they may have spoken an ancestral form. And remember that language we was pointing out earlier, that ancient language, right? It could have easily been, right? It could have easily been that ancient root language, right? It could have easily been that ancient root language, right? All the way to the Indo-European, even to his early Eurasiatic, right? Even to his early roots, right? So it's basically saying they were moving around. They want to have some early proto-Indo-European, so pre-Indo-European even, right? Into his proto form, his original form. As it says, I'm just going to show you without a doubt, how do we know that these languages did do a replacement? Because this study itself, word for word, says it. It says the best argument for the Anatolian hypothesis, right, that Indo-European languages arrived in Europe from Anatolia 8,500 years ago is that watch what it says here, is that major language replacements are thought to require major migrations. So it's very important. And that after the early Neolithic, when farmers established themselves in Europe, so after the early Neolithic, when farmers established themselves in Europe, the population base was likely to have been large, that later migrations would have not made such an impact. So it's those early ones that really matters. However, our study shows that a later major turnover did occur, that the steppe migrations replace the ancestry of Central Eurasians or Europeans. So that's very important. So now what does it mean about a replacement and all these things? Because if you look at the genetics too of that land, like we've seen with the bottleneck, these are new cultures that's going there, right? New animals, new domesticated animals, they're new to their nodes, new humans that's going there, new languages. All this stuff is new. All this stuff is new, happening at the same time right after the flood. All these animals are new. There's no animal today in the lands of Africa that's walking in the lands of Africa that was there billions of years ago. These are new generations that came off the ark, or 100, not billions of years, millions of years ago, right? There's none of those every ancient animal is extinct, right? Isn't that interesting? Why they try to tell you that there was an extinction of animals when you start to realize that they all start to disappear about the same time recently. Very interesting when you start to look at that and how those languages move about. So you can see right here, they would have obviously this would have been the area here. So this would have been like 8,000 something. And then they would have went out, right? They would have went out. Some would have settled over here early in the Indus Valley civilization, like we was talking about, how they went out, they settled in these areas, and then they settled in these other areas. So that would have been something that would have happened in these different areas. They would have settled all over, right? Just to show you where that image is coming from. This is coming from this little idea when they talk about indigenous Aryans and stuff like that. I don't believe in the Aryan idea, but it does talk about some interesting ideas of that same time frame, 7,000, 8,000 BC. Just look at what groups are bending together and binding together, right? It's rather better to look at what are the nodes, right? Because that F haplogroup throws a lot of people off. They don't know that F makes GHIJK, and they'll say like F is totally different than R when F actually makes R. So it's got to be careful on some of those things, or the origin of these groups. But they basically have the same-ish idea that Anatolia would be a hotspot in the Caucasus. Anatolia and the Caucasus would be a hotspot for these groups and how they spread out, whatnot. Just show that little image there. So let me show a little bit of something that I think is kind of interesting to kind of note right here, that the rise of the lingua francas and stuff later on. But first, let me show these two pieces. So remember I was talking about the flood stories all across the world. Here's an interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Interesting thing that's shown in the Genesis, Answers in Genesis museum. They show pretty much how all types of different societies not only talk about a flood story, but they talk about how they all built a boat to try to survive it, right? And as you know, like telephone game, generations down, this is like generations down. So they know the story, they heard the story, right? They're being told the story, so they're writing what they remember from it, right? But I thought it was interesting how all these societies that exist at the same time start writing about a flood legend.
Well, hi, everyone. Here we are.
I just want to jump ahead to this part where he goes and point it out because I thought this was kind of interesting.
To leave the range 300 to 500. Now, look, when I went to university, I remember one of the professors saying, now, The Jews have a story of a flood like the Babylonians. It's obvious the Babylonians, it's obvious the Jews borrowed their stories from the Babylonians. What would you say to that?
Well, here, let's look at the map over here. Here's why these guys are saying it. You've got the Jews living in here in the land of Israel, and you got the Babylonians right over here. In fact, here's one of the Babylonian type arcs. You know, you got it almost looks like a cube, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more. But they're saying that they borrowed theirs from this one. And it's embarrassing, actually, when you look at that, because when you actually see both accounts, one of them makes very little sense.
Hey, we can do that over here. Let's have a look at this. Here's the ark as we sort of have it here at Ark Encounter. And we'll talk about the shape here in a moment, okay?
And this is the
Epic of Gilgamesh,
one of the Babylonians,
which looks like a cube that's, what, 6 stories or so high?
Yeah, and it's just a cube. I mean, would you want to be in something like this in a flood?
I mean, it's obvious that the Jews looked at the Babylonian account of the flood, and then they had this.
Yeah.
That doesn't make
sense. I mean,
sense.
that's just crazy. I mean, something like this is going to wobble, flip over, go all over. I mean,
I can understand how you can start with this is the original, and then you get all sorts of changed versions.
Changes and variations.
That makes much more sense.
I think that.
So you see, if you ever seen there's a major list of so many different flood stories, right? A lot of different flood stories and everything and whatnot. But let me just show you something from what we were just talking about from all those combinations. All right, so I'm just gonna do a quick little summary on this. So as you can see, right? Let me just make sure I start this little thing over just to kind of point out what's going on here. So it's talking about the spreads of, because the next thing that happens, just like with those where did those flood stories come from? Writing. So when did writing start happening? About after 3000 BC. So Sumerians first, pictographic. Sumerians were writing flood stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's what we're just looking at. We was talking about some things of Gilgamesh and whatnot. And that's where that flood story starts to rise up. But there's flood stories all across the world, almost at the same time, the same-ish time. So the Sumerian pictograph will be very early. Then in Africa, we also will have some pictographics in the Egyptian culture. So remember, that's important too. So you can see Elamite. Also important to know about Elamite. Elam can also mean a mountaineer, people from the mountain and whatnot. So that can be some mixtures of Japheth and Shem over there. So very important. Right, and you can see so cuneiform rises up. That's gonna lead from the pictographic to more of something that was introduced in Anatolia, and a mixture of some Indo-European styles, whatnot, with some Semitic styles. A combination that happens after the lingua franca that happens. So Sumerian is the first lingua franca. That's important to understand. So very important to know about those things. So the language after Babel, as recorded, started around the time after the first lingua franca. So that's important. That is important. So first the people go and settle in different places. Then Babel happens. So when does Babel happen? Somewhere around 5,000, 4,000 BC, around the first lingua franca. Here's another idea of languages increasing. So from their origin and everything, where they start, obviously, as we see, cuneiform in the Indus Valley civilization and in Sumeria, right? Egyptian, Sumeria, Indus Valley civilization, right? You see how these societies would be the earliest ones because they're coming from where? The Ark and everything. So also people know how to take boats, so people can take off in a second, right? And apparently some leave here and they're probably making their way around and going to other places and whatnot. You can see this place also has those pictographics and whatnot. There's Chinese picking up some languages, right? These are going to be like where they find the actual archaeological evidence of these things, right? So like 2000, 3000 BC, a lot of these languages, these scripts start to come out and whatnot. So that's something that is important to note on these. So you can see right there, the earliest ones, right? Very early on, right? So after 4,000, that's going to be important. But that's for deeper information of Babel, after Babel and everything. So that's going to be something that's important to note. So after Babel, that's when the languages start to develop, and you're going to see more solid things for languages. So that was a quick summary of how those things were going about and spreading, right? There's a little more. We can go into detail on how those genetics spread, but I wanted to show you the evidence on not only. So let's go over here and make it make sense real fast. So we're gonna put it like this and make it make sense. So I'm gonna actually put a black box on this thing because we need to remove that one real fast right here, because let me think about how I want to make that. There you go. All right. All right. So let's put a line here. Kind of put a separation here. Right here. All right. So what did we see happen in this time frame? What were we seeing happen? So we already know that all these genetics would have existed at that time, right? After the catastrophic wipeout event. So this would be the flood. This will point to the time of the flood. Let me also put that here. So this will lead to the flood right here. So that's something that I'm just going to put a note there to note, because what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of important to note that there was a flood at these points here. So I'm just going to put that there for the flood. So the flood happens here, right? At this time frame, right? At these events, that would be the flood. In fact, I'll just put it right here. So it would be kind of understood. It would be understood. So the flood happens, right? So this is pre-flood events before the flood. These survived before the flood, and then here's the flood. So between 2000 for the biblical time frame, if you're counting genealogies, like 2000, 3000 BC. But remember, we also pointed out that would most likely be those genealogies. How it's counted like that would most likely be a genetic curve, a scientific genetic curve. So that's just something that's important, which is in the first video of the Synthetic Sunday on how a genetic curve works. But at this time, there was a flood. By the scientific means, that would be around the older and younger Dryas event. There's a flood that happens there. Remember, I showed the actual academic scientific understanding how there is no doubt that the water rose 400 feet and there was a catastrophic bottleneck that happened there. So a bottleneck happens, and many individuals are extinct, especially Arctic humans are gone. They're extinct. But what happens around 10,000 to 8,000 BC? So what happens? One of the first things we get is settlement. So let me make sure we put that down. So human settlement is first. So new animal and human settlement. That's to kind of make that understood, right? Let me remember some more settlement. We'll say not settlement. Let's say humans. We'll say migrate. So new animals and humans migrate. So this is important because we find all this evidence: new animals and humans, and language. So you gotta make this a little smaller. So what happens there? We'll say in human language, or not, right? That's a kind of put that there. I'm just thinking if it was something else. There's also agriculture, farming and agriculture, all that happens at the same time. That has to be understood. I don't know why I put an E there. All right, so there has to be understood that at that time there will be agriculture that increase in those lands. That's going to be something that also causes evidence of what's happening there. There's going to be farming. I'm going to also put introduction of farming. So all these happen at the same time. What do we know about Noah? Let's make sure we mention this about Noah. He's a farmer. So Noah's a farmer because of the wine, because it's vineyard. So Noah's a farmer. That's important. So that means that it makes sense. It would make sense, since he was a farmer, that farming was introduced in that land. So farming being introduced, that makes perfect sense, right? So since we know there was farming, that matches with Noah, that there was farming there. Then that's what, remember, we was pointing it out. And also language, because Noah spoke a language and they would settle early on. So it'd be new animal and human language migrating, pretty much. Long story short, right? So the language migrate and the introduction of farming. So that's what's happening at the same. All this is happening at the same time. Also, what else we know about all that? So that's happening in between these events. Pretty much, these can be counted together. But the amount of information that happens in it aligns with the Bible, right? It aligns with the Bible. But the time of Babel is actually going to be between 4,000 and 3,000 BC, and the events that happen there are going to be the biblical events. So that's going to be Babel right there. So Babel happens here. So that's why you get those languages and all those things developing there. Around this time is when that happens. Now, I would say more or less, just to correct this time frame, I would say, to be more scientifically correct, instead of 4,000 to 3,000, let's actually put 3,000. Let's put 3,000 to 2,000. This is when Babel happens, to be more exact, when the rise of language comes, about 3,000 to 2,000 BC. So this is important to know. This is exactly in between when Babel happens. So somewhere between these events. So in between this and this, as the humans settle in different places and language migrates and the introduction of farming, if you want to look at like the fossils and everything and look at all those things, you'll start to notice a very harmonious picture when you compare it to the Bible. And the harmonious picture is that after the catastrophic wipeout event, all the animals that was on the boat and the humans repopulated the earth, and a new language was introduced to the earth. It's interesting, at that same time, like we said, there was new animals being introduced to the earth, and there was a human language that migrated, right? That migrate all throughout the earth, right? And there was also the introduction of farming, right? That's very important. So we're going to have new humans settle in places, new animals, new languages, and farming at that time. All that makes perfect sense to what we see in the biblical narrative. So those things are going to completely align. Now, what's the major thing that I know about Babel? This is actually when they start introducing the written language. So written language is going to start coming in this time, in this later time. So written language. So I'm just going to put that here. So written language. So written language is going to be during the time of Babel. That's gonna also let us know about the flood accounts. So a lot of flood records are going to be in written language. So a lot of flood records. Let's put that like that, so we can understand that. Let's make that smaller. So at that time, there was a lot of flood records that took place. So that's something to take note of that had happened, right? If you already know it, right, you can look it up. A lot of flood records that happened in this time, right? So that's gonna be very important to note, is that during this time, and just to show you what that would look like, let's say we use a converter, right? Let's use the little converter. So that's why we talk about all this ancient stuff here and everything. And we was talk about Noah and everything, about him being in a lot of these little areas here, and then being a farmer, right? Because he had to be a farmer and everything. But he ended up settling his family in a lot of different areas, a couple different places and whatnot. So they're gonna settle in a couple different places all over, right? Because the introduction of farming at that time would be very important. But let me point out something here, right? So let's say languages were spreading around 3000 BC. But if we went on the scientific scale, it'd be 3000 BC. But on the biblical scale, it would be 19 BC. So you can see right there. So just like we see where language is starting to spread around 3000 BC on the biblical scale, that'd be 19 BC. So that's right before Abraham comes in, which makes sense. Nimrod would be there, Babel would happen, and all of a sudden, after the events of Babel and everything, right? Then we get the exact time where Abraham was going to come in a little later. So like 1817 BC, Abraham's going to be there officially, right? But this stuff is what's happening early on. So this is some stuff that's happening a little early on with the understanding of the exaggerated dates to get a good understanding of these things. So that's a great understanding of what's happening there at its fullness until it's finally finished and everything, to get a good idea of that. So on the scale, you're getting a good idea of what's happening there. Now, if we also take note, at the same time when Babel happens, they all get their diverse languages and it's all solid. And the evidence of languages, right? Like we just showed on those videos, they only exist relatively close to that time of Babel, right? For
relatively few.
For the evidence of those languages, for the actual evidence of those languages and everything. All right, so let me make sure I think to myself if I had something else I want to go over. I do. Let me make sure. All right, so we went over that cattle and everything. Just gonna check these, see, and then we're gonna do a quick summary on some things and point out those similarities on there. Let's look in there. We don't need that. We don't need that. This one was just one to go a little more into Nimrod, but we'll go a little more into Nimrod a little later when we go into some things. All right, so checking that. Don't need nothing there. All right, just making sure. All right, we're gonna do a quick little summary on the stuff that we touched, right? Because that was at that time frame, there was a lot of idolatry that happened at that time, right? When I say a lot of idolatry, let me show you an example. And I'm only showing you this so you know. Understand when I say this. I'm only showing you this so you know this, right? So there's a lot of idolatry that was happening during that time. So 7,000-year-old burial in this place has the earliest Asherah, how you say that? Asherah. And if you know, that's an idol that apparently is found later on in the biblical narrative as something that is hated. So it's highly detested, but this will be the earliest one, right? If you want to get a little highlight of what I mean of what this is, let me just kind of tell you what's going on here. So they just found it, right? It was a place of worship starting around 7,500 years ago and whatnot, found in one of the graves and whatnot. But it says this may be, they claim, nothing other than the earliest Asherah ever found, right? They just say predecessor of a cult that would come to be embraced by the Canaanite and abhorred by the Yahwehists. What does it mean, abhorred by the Yahwehists? Yeah, what is a Yahwehist? Right. Sometimes you'll see some scholars say Yahwehist and all that, Yahwehism and whatnot. It's just an early thing of Judaism and whatnot, pretty much, whatnot. And it's another way of saying it. I'm just gonna leave it like that, right? But this was one of those things, whatnot, what's happening here. Obviously, just because people fail doesn't mean God failed, right? But this was what was happening here. This is the introduction of that early idol. That idol was there a long time ago, but it remained in those cultures for a long time. So you even see this thing in the Bible spoken of. So the Bible does recognize ancient deities, not that they're deities, but that they existed a long time ago. Ancient things that still linger in the Middle East. I don't know if they still linger today, but they could. But this is just one of those things that was a practice that was happening a long time ago. And look, it's still in the time frame that we're talking about. So that's the only reason I'm talking about it, because there's no other way to have a conversation on something like this. But this is something that did happen. And if you're curious, if we do have evidence that people were literally doing this early on, right? Because this was something that was happening. Let me just show you an example on how we know they were doing this thing, which what's the word I'm looking for? They shouldn't did this thing that was happening here. Let me go to one of these that I didn't use like this. I'll just show you an example of what I mean. Let me just show that. So early cultures, apparently earlier cultures had a bunch of idols. Like a lot of cultures had a bunch of idols. And I don't know if you want to go into it, but some of the cultures in Mesopotamia had idols early on, very early on, and that's what caused a lot of problems in that land, right? That's also something to know about Nimrod, that Nimrod means, what does it mean? To rebel or something like that. And it could be, basically, his name could be a term that's used rather than being a person. He could be a person, could be used as a term to someone, right? Just to kind of, maybe I'll just close that. I don't know what's going there. All right. This is actually it that I was going to point out. Let me see what's going on here. What's going on here? Okay. Make sure it's good. Make sure it's straight. All right, let me see. Make sure everyone's straight. All right. All right. Let's see if this will open up for me real fast. Just to kind of bring it all home now. And while that's opening, I also I made sure there was something else I wanted to point out over here somewhere, right here. So remember we was talking about some of those things, of all those things that were happening there. I'm going to use this as a little summary and everything. So they also, when looking at the genetics, right, post Neolithic Y chromosome bottleneck explained by culture, hitchhiking and whatnot of these clans. Maybe we talk about that bottleneck and whatnot. They have a lot of studies on it, on this bottleneck and whatnot that we was just talking about of the Neolithic, right? Just talks about some of those things that we was talking about all across the world, 5,000 to 7,000 BP, right? All happening around the same time frame, right? Around the same time frame. There's about evidence of the bottleneck, right? We spoke about this the other day, yesterday, right? We was talking about the evidence that there is going to be a evident bottleneck on every Y chromosome or every chromosome, right? That they all basically came out of a genetic bottleneck. That was a mass extinction from individuals that have been related to them a long time ago, right? But we know that all the lineages today that came out of that bottleneck, they would be the sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the ones that survived the flood, right? That filled the whole earth. So that's going to be very, very important to take a note of, right? With their cattle and the extension of their languages. We'll not go back over here. So you can see this little study basically goes into those depths and basically lets us know basically what we went over in a summary is indeed is true, right? All these things that you're seeing is indeed true, right? So let's do a little quick summary of what we was talking about real fast. So I'll leave this right here because we're gonna need this. It's about the donkey. Let's see. Yeah. All right. I'll leave that there. Let me just line them up for this summary here. Line them up so we can do a nice little summary of what we were just talking about. All right. Just making sure we don't got nothing there. All right. Let's close those and whatnot. So I just wanted to, tell you about this because, yeah, it's, like I said, it's connected to the Bible and whatnot. Like it says right there, talk about some things. Even remember that idol is also found later on and whatnot in the Bible, but it was there a long time ago. It existed a long time ago. And apparently like the Natufians, we know that they were like shamans and stuff like that and whatnot, but they would have been right before the event. So like I seen someone have a conversation talk about how the Natufian also show evidence of like Adam. It would show evidence of like sons of Adam, like early Seth and stuff like that. And that's what we will see with those lines before the flood and everything. Because in the PPNB is where they start to increase and everything. But these also were individuals that would have survived. These were be individuals that would have survived the flood. Some of them went to the other side. Some of them would have been wiped out. Just get that understood. And it just goes over some, pretty much what's the word I'm looking for. That, yes, do you see how it says 9,000 years ago and everything? That time frame that we was talking about and everything, that's when a lot of these stuff start popping up. That the cultures started to fall away instantly after the flood for some reason and did their own things. And that's probably why, later on the Israelites had their own little guide to how they should be saved and whatnot, instead of, just letting the people run amok and whatnot. So just to kind of show that's was one of those things that they found there. But they did find like other stuff. Like they found a site at Edom, right? They found that apparently Edom might have been doing this as well. Just a lot of them was worshiping idols. It says the trunk was probably been brought to the site from the Edomite mountains in today's Jordan. So you can see where it's talking about that. Edomite some connections with some of this and something, So it was just connected to these things. I'm just gonna leave it like that because there's a lot of other stuff in it, but I'm just leave it like that with it. Obviously, Most High has nothing to do with this, right? But just know that, like the book says, it did point out that there was evidence of that ancient idol even being used in ancient times, just to kind of point that out. So long time ago, they had a quick fall away. That's the best way to put it. And that's probably why Nimrod rose up and everything. So here's a summary. Let's make sure we do a summary here. So we already went over the stuff earlier yesterday, but now we're going to talk about what we talked about today. The first and most important thing is that after the catastrophic flood, which seems that it shows a bottleneck in the Neolithic and a massive flood event in the Neolithic, where the water rose 400 feet, right, causing a massive catastrophic bottleneck. We know that almost all over the earth, in fact, all over the earth, there were new animals, right? Between 10,000, 8,000, whatnot, right? Especially 8,000, 8,700, all that. There were new animals and everything, right? And there was a human language introduced into that area. But we know that when humans first came off the ark, they all had a uniform language. They all had a uniform language. So when they left out the ark, they had a uniform language. So that's very important to know that at this time they had one language. Make sure we put that here. So we verified that at least in this time frame before 10,000 BC, before the flood, right? When converted, we know how to also convert that to the time frame we need. But there was one language at first when it left out, right? Then later on, they developed different languages, right? So it's very important. So as that one language went, as people went into different areas, they developed different branches of that language, of their languages, right? But then at the time of Babel, they also had a lingua franca. We'll get into pinpoints on Babel tomorrow. We'll get into the lingua franca. So it's going to be between 3,000 to about 2,000 BC. So 3,000, 2,000 BC, we're going to look at. And that's going to give us like major events within that 1,000-year time frame. It's going to give us what happened with those written languages and whatnot, what's going on there. And the first lingua franca. So there's going to be here, the first lingua franca. So that's going to be very important. So if you already know what's a lingua franca, right? What is a lingua franca? Lingua franca, a language that is adopted as a common language between speakers whose native languages are different. So that's what's important. When it says that the whole world was one language, that's what's going to be important to take note of is the lingua franca, the first lingua franca, right? The first. I want to tell you right off the back. It's not the first one. The first one is Sumerian, so the Sumerian language. I don't know if it'll say right here. I'll just put it down. See if I just type Sumer, way to show it. Yeah, Sumer would be, as it says, Sumerian is historically the first language, right, fulfilling our criteria of a lingua franca. So Sumerian is your first lingua franca. And that's what we're going to get into, like the pinpoints of the Sumerian culture and everything. But it also started, it has to do with the time frame we're talking about too. So as you can see, the Sumerian culture, they had to do with the time frame that we're talking about and whatnot. So dating back to 3000 BC. But the Sumerian culture actually has ties to an earlier culture. How you say it? Umayyad culture, right? Sumerian actually will link to Umayyad. I do not fully know how you spell that. Let me see if I can. No. Let's see. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you spell that, but we'll point that out a little later when we go over that and how Sumerian developed its lingua franca. We'll go over how Sumerian developed its lingua franca and why that's important for the first Babel, for Babel's rise. So we're going to talk about that and why that's important, right? Because it's not that they never had a language, and it's not that their language never been different. It's that their language became one. It became united. So they all became one in one territory, and they built Shinar, right? They built that, well, not Shinar. They built Babel in the lands of Shinar. So we'll talk about that and the details of it. And it's gonna be kind of interesting of it. But this what we did today is leading us to the in-betweens of Babel. So the events after the flood has to be understood before we understand Babel. So the events after the flood has to be understood before we understand Babel. So the reason why it looks so large is because right after the flood, right, you got catastrophic events that happen, right? Lots of water, and it's going to cause all these major changes, right? So very, very important. So let me grab my little yellow line here. All right. Let's see what time it is. Looks good. All right, so everything up here we already verified. So what do we know? After they got off after the flood, after they got out of the ark, Ham, Shem, and Japheth all had one language. We know that's also evident, as we had seen earlier, right? So I'm just gonna do a flash of everything that we had talked about. So when we talked about the languages, all languages root to an ultimate language a long time ago. They would have all been one in the Fertile Crescent, right? Just south of the Caucasus. So that would have been a super language that in one of the studies called Tower of Babel project, they found out that there was a language that basically unites, right? Linking the major language families of Eurasia. So they let us know that there was one language that links a lot of languages together at a common ancestor with common ancestral words. And we found out that there was an ancient language that linked all these languages together before the flood. And after the flood, it would have showed that that language proceeded on until the later divisions of languages. So some new languages that will later come in with its new divisions. But we do know that at the flood, the scientific time of the flood, and after the flood, there was a uniform language. Later on, as the people expanded, right? Let's go over here. So there was one language, but later on, as the people expanded, that would cause different branches of language. That would happen. So different languages will happen. That would mean that they have to wait until they have what is called a lingua franca, the first lingua franca for Babel, right? So that's going to be very important that they have that lingua franca so that they come together. So we know that the new animals and the humans filled up the earth. Let's also write that down on the side of over here, right? So what did they do? They replenished the earth, right? In fact, what's the scripture? What scripture is that says that they replenished the earth? Because that is a pinpoint scripture, right? Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and everything. So right before these events, before I tell you about Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their families and everything, the covenant of the rainbow. So they get the covenant of the rainbow and everything, and they get a peace, basically a peace offering and everything. And what was blessed? The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth. Isn't it interesting how they move with everyone on the earth? So it says, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. And what? What did all the animals, what did every living creature that got off the ark, what did they do? They replenished the earth, right? Every living creature at that time after the flood was new after the flood, filling up the whole earth. That's why we went and read every domesticated animal was from the Middle East. We can also verify a type of area where we have every living creature in one place too. Just to kind of say that outwardly. But this is actually evidence that right after the flood, just like the Bible says, the whole earth received a new language, it received a new people, and it received the replenishing of this new animal subclades. So this is actually very important to note that the Bible is telling us a very detailed picture. Not just humans are filling the earth, but animals are filling the earth, right? And they're all having that same language at this time. That's what we were just verifying too, that they had the same language. So let's go and put that down. So they replenished the earth. So replenish the earth, right? So replenish the earth. So we see that had happened, and that matches exactly with what happened. New animals and human languages, right, migrate, and the introduction of farming, right, and they replenish the earth. And what were we finding out with all those movements of the donkey and all those things? We can point out real fast on this little part. Remember we talk about that? African domesticated animals with the exception of the donkey, which we also verified that the donkey was down there as well with that 7,000 year ago right there, right? Found that the donkey also was found down there after that 7,000 year time. But they found out that right here, some 8,000 years ago, cattle, sheep, and goats came south to the Sahara, which was much wetter than today. So all the animals migrated into Africa. All the animals migrated into Africa, and they also migrated to other different areas. So all the animals, there was a mass replacing throughout different areas. So that's very important because that was a Neolithic bottleneck at a time, and many different animals went extinct because of that flood and those events that happened there, right? So that's something that's important to take note of. So we can see without a doubt, without a shadow of a doubt, that if we look at the whole picture, it's starting to make perfect sense. So replenish the earth, all these things that makes all that aligns together to them replenishing the earth. So all those things, right? Put a line here. All those things line together, that these groups and the animals replenish the earth. That means, let me make sure you write it down. Animals, put that like this. And humans. So that's very important. So then at the time of the Babel, we're going to also have increases of language. So animals and humans replenish the earth, right? So that's very, very important. So we know that Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they had one language, right? They all had one language and everything. But they also going to have that lingo Franca, what we're going to talk about another time when we go with that. But first things we got to verify, like we said, replenishing the earth. That's definitely what had happened. There's no doubt that the replenishing of the earth had happened doubtlessly when they get off the ark. All those animals replenish the earth. All the people replenish the earth, and a new language start introducing itself into the earth, right? Even from that root ancient language that all languages have rooted to, then you start seeing these new languages until we get to the time of Babel, when new written forms come in, major language just come in, especially the lingo Franca of Sumerian that we're going to talk about. So far, so good. So far, everything looks aligned. So what we did today, we looked at information from 10,000 to 3,000 BC, or 10,000 to 4,000 more or so, right? I'll put this at the end point right here, 4,000. I'll just put, we went here, written language, we'll just put 4,000 or something. We'll put right here, 4,000. Kind of make that highlight there, that's when these languages come in, and we're going to get a major point that's going to happen in these areas. So indeed, they replenished the earth. These lines replenish the earth. All right, I could have probably put it right here for how they replenish the earth and everything. But that's something that does happen there, that they replenish the earth. All right. Fact, I'm going to, so that everything's all evened out, because we don't need these purple lines right here. I'm going to make sure I put this here. So this is actually very interesting, because when you take the scientific means and you take the Bible and you look at it like this, it makes perfect sense. So it makes perfect sense to what's happening here. So animals and humans, they replenish the earth, right? So that's very, very important that we're seeing that. I'm gonna put 1,000 right there. So they replenish the earth. I'm gonna put that line there, just to say it again. So they replenish these ones, right? Replenish the earth with their animals and their language. So they replenish the earth with their animals and their language, right? So that's very, very important. All those things are going to be very, very, very important for those things to be understood. So since we do know that what's the word I'm looking for? Since we do know that there was a replacement, a massive replacement, and a massive new language, and a massive replacement of animals, we know that all that's going to align with what the biblical narrative is saying, right? So that's going to be very, very important. So all that, right, was shown today that we were talking about. This actually goes with some more accurate stuff right here. So we talked about the animals and everything. We talked about the language, how the languages start and develop all over these areas. We talked about their origin. We talked about who could be Nimrod and everything, what's possible for him to exist, right? Who could he have been, right? We talked about where humans started off at. Humans started off in the Fertile Crescent, right? And they spread out from here. They started developing idols and all types of stuff and whatnot. They had their own different types of languages that started to develop and everything. And they would have settled all across the whole world. They were filling the earth before even the bringing people into SHINAR and everything. And also the evidence of their agriculture, right? The evidence of their agriculture shows that they started at the same place. They started here and they started to increase in other places. And we verified also with the languages and everything and whatnot. I can go a little more into it by talking about jade, the product of jade, and how that went from here and went to China and everything. I'm not going to do it right now, but that's something that we can go about and talk about. That's something that did happen, right? Let me actually open up something here just to see. Amen. I'm gonna point out that little source there. Let me just point something out here because this one's kind of interesting with jade. This one though, I'm gonna do a little thing a little later with China and a couple of different things that's happening there. But I thought this trade with jade was kind of interesting because it goes with the movement of pans. I know that sounds weird, pans and jade, you know, why were these moving together and whatnot? It's because pans was kind of settled in Eurasia and then jade was kind of moving with it. So you can see right here, so a lot of cultures early on had pans, but it was mostly European cultures that had pans. All that you're seeing here is all the cultures that had pans. Pans is actually an interesting development and everything. So you can see a lot of these northern cultures that had pans and whatnot. That also increases for the understanding of lingua francas and whatnot and everything. But the reason why I wanted to show this is because at that time frame, that's when you're also, remember at that yellow river, these river right here. And I was talking about some things that are happening over here when it's talking about farming and stuff, whatnot. They also know that over there, they also had like the emergence of jade. So you can see right here, they got some jade objects in the 8th millennium BC and everything, the Neolithic cultures and whatnot. They were getting really into jade over there and other stuff, whatnot. That was kind of interesting.
You saw the outlines of. All right, well, moving on to our third headline of the day. Well, so a couple months ago, I covered a huge number of artifacts that have been found in sacrificial pits at the site of Sansingdui in China. And we're talking about like thousands of items going back 3,000 to 4,500 years, over 1,200 items of bronze, over 500 items of gold, and over 500 items of jade. So a lot of artifacts being uncovered there. So what I covered this week was a large bronze statue of an unknown creature, which was unearthed a year actually after archaeologists had first spotted it in the pit. Weighs an impressive 300 pounds.
So this is an interesting little video, but it talks about basically some of the jade that was moving around and everything. It was something that was happening in the Neolithic and everything, and it basically ties because they later used jade a lot in China and everything. So it's part of the linguistics, pretty much. Long story short, only way I could put that. But It also goes to, as you can see right here, I'm gonna do something a little later on it. Jade ended up going to pretty much from, as you can see right here, Jade has a long history of more than 3,000 years in basically Mesoamerica, Mexico, and a couple different areas. So remember how I talked about that? How China apparently has some ties to America. This also would tie some things together of that. This would tie some things of that together. How China does have ties, as we see right here, because it's rarity. So it's about jade and everything, highly prized in the Mayan kings and Chinese emperors. So maybe there's some interesting ties of the Mayans and the Chinese and other groups, because everyone started off on one side of the world and then they kind of reached out and everything. Only reason I'm just showing that because there's some extra deep stuff of some ties of some cultures and whatnot concerning jade and whatnot. But I'm just gonna leave it like that because that also increases the linguistic changes, because China also picks up some linguistic terms that seems different, but their genetics, again, they're the same as many on other sides of the world, but they have some very different linguistic compounds. Because obviously, if everyone's in the world, you can't get every single person to SHINAR, right? They're not going to all build Babel, but whoever's in this area is going to be of one language, and they're going to have a lingua franca. We'll talk about that later. But this is just some interesting information that I thought was kind of interesting. So we know that people had started here, and the earliest place they went to was here. But then you can see right here, they would have went out. They could have went over here. So on this side right here, where it's green, they could have went out all the way and settled over here. That's why the Mayans also have jade and different things like that, different interesting trades of similarities and whatnot, because that's just something that happens. Because they go right from China, then they leave China and they go to these little islands, then they go to the Americas. So that's something that's important for the farming. For farming reaches all the way over there at the same time, same time after the flood events and whatnot. And we know that the languages are all, we can put them into their category and everything. So that's what we went over today. We went over a little bit of how the animals repopulated everything and how humans populated everything. So just gotta make sure none of these is extra. So this is just what we talked about, all the animals, right? All the animals replaced the animals in the south and everything, right? That's something that we know. All this extra stuff, I'll just throw some stuff in the description. So I'll add some meat to the description. So before I go though, if there's any questions, let me know and we'll touch on those things. Any questions, and we will definitely touch on those things, because what's the word I'm looking for? It's always good to get an assurance or a recap or anything, or a verification on these things. Now, for everyone to know, I'm a young earth creationist, but this is a method in order to show someone who is, maybe you got to show like an atheist or someone who's an old earth creationist or someone academically wise. This is actually how to explain it academically wise, scientifically wise, with the full evidence and everything. So understanding biblical alignment and the scientific, undebunkable scientific method. So this is actually the true way, like, to put these things in perspective that has extreme supporting material. So that's going to be something that to take note of these things. So with that, if you want to see, I'll put some videos in the description. I'll point out three videos I'm going to put in the description. And the reason why is because I can't get super deep into the separations of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, but those are important to know about for this time frame, for after the flood, the separations of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, which we do match each one with its haplogroup and its language. So the one I'm going to put in the description is this one, how our elder brother Japheth took and ruled the ancient Levant and Mesopotamia, part 2 and part 1. So I'll just put like Japheth, and I'll put this one and this one in between it. Or I'll put Japheth in between these two links, because they are 2 parts and they go together. And then I'll put, when we talked about Shem, and I'll just call it Shem when I add it. And that one is going to actually be a little bit down here where we had talked about Shem. In fact, I think it's up here. I think I'll pass it real quick. Just to point it out right here, putting the real sons of Shem on the map based on genetic DNA, only BC fossils, DE-YAT. So I'll add that to the description for Shem and everything. If you want to go into Shem and Japheth, I gotta do a deeper video on Ham, so that might be coming soon. We'll do a little more deeper into Ham and his language, because still finishing a note on his click languages. Apparently the ones in Africa, they had some click languages. These ones down here, like the ones that go deep into these areas, they start to pick up some click languages for some reason. And we'll point that out, which is, it makes a little difference in a way. And make sure I finish what I'm saying here. So I'll add those to the description for a highlight of that. And the rest will be just the sources of what we talked about today. And I'll put the, as always, the SS Synthetic Sunday at the bottom. So with that, family, that's all we got for today. Let me one more time verify it with a quick 1-minute summary. If you want to find the evidence of the biblical narrative to the academic sources, you gotta be willing, listen to me when I say this, you gotta be willing to throw away your mind frame on how those years are calculated. You gotta first align similarities, align the similarities and the absolutes, right? What does the Bible say that are absolutes, right? Absolutely has to be a Adam and Eve, and thank the Most High that he put the life in the blood, because we can see that genetically there is an Adam and Eve. And we know that those nodes make clades, just like how Adam and Eve make sons, daughters. We also know that there was evidence of ancient humans, Arctic humans, or archaic humans that existed a long time ago. And we know that there's a different category of humans called modern humans that exist even to this day and a long time ago. We know that Cain would have counted as ancient pre-flood humans, and Ham, Shem, and Japheth from Noah will count as modern humans that exist. We know that there's some lineages, A, B, YAP negative, D, E, YAP plus, and CF, YAP negative, that don't make each other, but they do descend from one common descent, and they would ultimately come from Adam, and ultimately from a mid split, which will be your Eurasian Adam, CT, which will actually be our Noah. That's actually very important. And we know that that's scientifically sound, because all these three groups are three groups that don't make each other. So that's very important. We also know those groups are the ones that's also involved, not the Arctic humans. So all the Arctic humans are gone. So Arctic humans, ancient archaic humans are gone, but modern humans live. So these groups increase, not ancient humans, not the A's with the 3 zeros and A with 4 zeros, which were the ancient humans. They are wiped out. Once they're wiped out after the flood then is going to be an event that, remember, it's a process. It's a process. The flood is a process. So it happens within a year, and it's going to show itself to be catastrophic. So if we look on science, what it would look like a process. And that's what it looks like. It was a process. But it did show evidence of a Neolithic bottleneck, right? A catastrophic bottleneck, meaning a wipeout of many species, and the fact that there was a flood worldwide, 400 feet in rise, right? That's very important. I wanted to write that on here. I probably should write that. That is 400 feet. I'll probably write that a little later. And at that time, we also verified scientifically that they had one language. So at that time, they had one language. Even to the next phase, they had one language. So they could have been bilingual into Babel. They could have been bilingual, and then they pick up a lingua franca later on. So they could have been bilingual. But we do know, just like how the Bible says, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth, to the humans and the animals. There were new animals that filled the earth. There were human languages that filled the earth through the migration of humans and the introduction of farming, because Noah was a farmer. So we know that since Noah was a farmer and the introduction of farming was happening at the same time, all of that is aligned. And we also know that written language is going to start popping up when Babel happens. So we'll leave this right here. This part right here is the next thing we're going to hit right here. And we're going to connect it with the Bible on why that's important. Language, written language, and the first lingua franca. So with that, family, may you be blessed. May you be beloved. And amen.